Good morning, everybody. Um, Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We are just letting a few more people in, but we're very excited to have you. I'm going to introduce first our acting chair of the undergraduate architecture department at Pratt Institute, who will open us up today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Lee. I'm the acting chairperson for undergraduate architecture at Pratt Institute. I want to say thank you and welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I'm sure more people will be joining. I want to just say a quick thank you to how this event came about. I still remember, I think it was a quick conversation that Jonathan and I had about how it'd be great if we can have an event at the pools. Unfortunately, we couldn't, but I want to still thank the New York City Parks Department that has been helping and contributing to our second year curriculum, especially in terms of civic infrastructure. And is a great sort of panel of guests that we have here today. And I'm really looking forward to listen to the conversation. And in addition, I also want to thank obviously the Dean's Office for helping to organize this event, along with Professor Laura Diamond and Assistant Dean Killian Riano. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Jonathan Shelser, who is the coordinator of second year design. And I'm looking forward to a great morning and afternoon of conversation.
Thank you, Jason. I'm just going to show a few slides to get us our feet wet today. No, well, I guess pun intended. I didn't mean it when I started it. Let's see what we've got here. Just give me one moment to get my acclimation. Okay. And we will do this. So welcome, everybody. Today we are joined by an exceptional cast of academic and professional characters who are here to explore the topic of the pool as an architectural, political, and social space within our cities. Over the past 2 years, Pratt Institute's undergraduate second year students have examined the pool and the bathhouse as a critical public institution over 2 projects. Beginning in the fall, their second year, coming fresh from the summer, the heat of the summer, we've examined a bathhouse changing station as a place where many bodies collect and get down to their most bare and engage in the collective act of bathing, warming, and changing. And as a second project, we bring these ideas and expand that focus to introduce a new public bathhouse as an addition to the campuses of the New York Parks WPA pool system, a few of which projects are shown here. As a program, the pool and bathhouse has allowed students to explore issues of the body at the scale of the person and at the scale of the water, which prompts issues of climactic, the thermal, the social, and of course, identity. Over the course of our first 2 years of running this program, we've examined 5 sites constructed during the New Deal era of American politics under the thorny administration of Robert Moses, the so-called master builder. This history, which we will get into for much of today, sets the table for the discussion on how these existing pools interact with the community, which community, and what is the role of large-scale public infrastructure, of which these sites and buildings are certainly spectacular, within the public realm. We are joined today by Pratt's partner in this initiative, Mark Foat, who serves as New York City's Parks Department Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer. Mark has provided our students with unbelievable access to these facilities, with impeccably detailed guided tours through which our students have learned that these pools are building, yes, building, not landscape, we'll get into that later, and that through their careful planning and maintenance, they provide a critical role as a social and collective binder, a thickening agent within our cities. But to begin our symposium, let's discuss why we should be talking about pools right now in 2021. As we are aware, the current administration, and by administration, we're referring to our national administration, has put forth an agenda that is meant to provide great and overdue upkeep of many of the societal constructs that have not been paid attention to for many years. In many cases, we have witnessed that much attention has been placed on new roads, highways, bridges, and rail, while casting other ideas as not real infrastructure. Putting aside for a moment the misguided semantics of Fox News, what is clear is that what constitutes infrastructural spending has some disagreement, and for what it's worth, there seems to be an inability to find consensus on spending for social programs that do not have brick, mortar, and steel attached to it. This presented schism in how we think about infrastructure and the way our society spends public money is disturbing on many levels. though I would like to highlight the problematic perspective on both sides of the ideological chasm. On the one side, the debate demonstrates that a large portion of our society is uncomfortable with the spending on abstraction and requires symbolic physical gestures to substantiate the use of collective funding. On the other side of the debate, I would argue the deep distrust and skepticism on the efficacy of buildings, landscape, and construction as a mechanism to stir social change and debate is equally problematic. Given that these two portions of our population seem to be getting intellectually farther apart, and that we are recovering from a pandemic that pushed us physically into our own echo chambers, it should not be surprising that spaces such as the pool, which are meant to bring us together, seem like things of the past. Nevertheless, we may acknowledge that the public pool sits firmly in the center as a physical and architectural space built and funded by the public, whose programmatic purpose is to bring the population together as a social forum. In many ways, the pool may be seen as a mirror of the architectural profession, as a steward of public health within the civic realm, because of course, we must remember that pools and bathhouses, urban beginnings, were just this, as a mechanism to provide a common space for hygiene prior to the distribution and privatization of plumbing within our dense cities. And whether we still require the pool for hygiene, we may remind ourselves that the pool retains a different form of civic health. To quote a friend, Christy Pearson, the author of The Architecture of Bathing, the people's history of bathing is one of shared space. Histories and practices of bath belong to the history and practices of the commons. To this end, it should not be surprising that the bathhouse and the pool architecture has appeared in many forms throughout modern and pre-modern history as tied to specific political and social movements that prioritize the unification of these buildings, for bathing begins to communicate a unification in their constructed space of the commons, an architectural celebration of the unified territory and optimism of the common class of the worker. An investigation into the public precedents of pool within the 20th century of the United States remind us that these as civic spaces cannot be examined without a foray into the challenges our society holds in terms of race, gender, sex, and ethnicity. These grand architectural spaces created for public bathing, wherein we strip down to our most bare, have frequently become lightning rods, which charge the issues of identity. Shown here, the Sutro bathhouses, built at the turn of the 20th century, became one of the earliest spaces of racial litigation in the country, wherein John Harris successfully sued the establishment for being denied entry on 2 occasions because of his race. Today, we will hear from 2 presenters who will discuss the effects and the challenges of desegregation on the design and creation of pools in our society. We are joined by Dean Marta Guttmann, whose research has uncovered much of how the infamous master builder of New York, Robert Moses, engaged or perhaps did not engage with these thorny issues of racial equity, while commanding much of the city's newfound New Deal resources in the construction of projects such as Colonial Pool, later to become Jackie Robinson Pool, one of the sites which our second year at Pratt is engaging with today. Simultaneously, presenters A.L. Hu and Nicholas Kemper have tracked the privatization of the pool over the course of the 20th century, wherein much like the movie theater, the shopping mall, and the arcade, this wet and watery piece of infrastructure migrated from the civic realm into the confined privacy of domestic compounds. Is this the inevitable end of capitalist society's ability to disengage with the public, or are there new and profound design possibilities for what might be considered new pool collectives? For in a sense, we may remember what is inherent to the formal nature of our very disciplines of architecture and landscape architecture. The act of pooling itself is a form of collecting or creating collectivity. By breaking the ground and making a zone that is distinctly separated, we effectively also create the possibility for a focused and charged space of political assembly, much like a courtyard or plaza. It is also important to note that as designers, the pool is a return to discussion about space rather than a discussion about object. The architecture of bathing naturally prioritizes space, hapticity, materiality, thermodynamics, atmosphere, and relations to polysensuality. New materialist philosophies and actor network theories seem to rise to the proverbial top within the bath, where ontological terrain seems to fall away into the backdrop of the water, which is always in motion. Fortunately, we are also going to be joined by 2 designers today, 2 young designers who have been engaging in the discourse about how we may move forward in the reconsideration of this part of our infrastructure. Our presenter, Carolina Chajek, will provide perspective on how the pool as a facility has the capacity to take on the expanded the expanded role of infrastructure, a space which, due to its annual operation, can provide functions to users during the closed session, functioning year-round for social gatherings, education, and health. And we are, of course, also fortunate to be joined by one of the initial designers of the Plus Pool project, destined for to be floating around the East River, a project which seeks to reconnect our sense of what is ephemeral public infrastructure in a way that actually begins to question, how do we tackle this new additions of social pieces without perhaps contributing to gentrification? So given this rich history, the foundational question as we stand on the precipice of a new wave of government funding, we may soon have to ask the question, not ask the question of why do we no longer build public pools, but how can the design of new public pools stoke us to confront and unmask the deep problems of social justice and inequity hidden in our contemporary world? To that, I would like to introduce my collaborating partner for our design studio from NYC Parks, Mark Foat, who is the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer of New York City Parks and Recreation. He's a licensed landscape architect with over 30 years of experience in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors and academic areas of practice. He comes to New York from Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, where he previously served as the first Deputy Commissioner, overseeing operations, maintenance, planning, capital property management, urban forestry, ecosystem management, and security for 10,000-acre system comprised of 200 passive parks, 55 recreation centers, 97 playgrounds, and 71 outdoor swimming pools. Mark, I would like to give it over to you to say a few words before we begin our symposium.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you today, and it's been great working with Jonathan and all of his colleagues from Pratt now in the second year of this study of our historic Olympic pools. As Jonathan mentioned, Mark Foat, my responsibilities along with that of my team is that Parks is to manage all of the physical infrastructure of the agency. And during the summers, that includes both our beaches and our pools. In New York City, we have 53 outdoor swimming pools, and the topic of today's symposium could not be more timely. Basically from two perspectives, the first being the federal pending infrastructure bill, both social and physical infrastructure bill, and what resources that might bring to us at Parks or to the city of New York. And then also the larger social awakening and reckoning that we've all been going through since the pandemic and the tragic murder of George Floyd last June. It feels that these public spaces, all of our public spaces in New York, including our pools, have become much more integral to our lives and how we function and interact with each other. At New York City Parks, we're extraordinarily proud that our outdoor pools are free and open to the public. There is no requirement for identification. You don't need to be a resident of the city of New York. You don't need to show any kind of citizen status. You need to show no ID in order to come in and use our pools. We serve approximately 1.5 to 2 million visitors a year, or in a season, in the summer season, at our 53 pools. This past season we just completed was understandably down from that due to the COVID fatigue and several other factors, including the wettest July we've ever had on record, which tends to put a damper, pun intended, on pool attendance. One of the things we are very proud of is that our pools are very much loved and are very much the focus of neighborhoods. Many of our patrons are there almost daily, certainly the young kids and the teenagers. They establish strong ties and relationships to the management, the lifeguards, everyone that takes care of them and makes sure that they have a safe and clean and pleasant and fun or relaxing environment. The one thing I would also note is our pools serve not just as that source of refreshment and relaxation, but we actually serve meals at our pools. So this past summer, we served over 160,000 meals to kids who come and use our pools and use the pools as their source of nutrition that they would normally get when they're in school. And of course, in the summer, they're not in school. The history of pools at Parks evolved in 3 periods. The first period, which was the late 1930s, the WPA era, Robert Moses era, is very much the focus of this work and was the the period that gave birth to our iconic, what we call Olympic pools, but they're actually much larger than a standard Olympic pool. We then went through 2 other rounds of pool construction in the 1970s that brought us a whole series of what are called intermediate pools, which are much smaller neighborhood pools, and then our famous mini pools, which are very small pools that can only accommodate somewhere between 24 and 36 people. We are always challenged to maintain our pools, but we are also very proud of the fact that almost all the maintenance of our pools is done internally by our own staff at parks, plumbers, amazing skilled trades, technical trade men and women that make sure our pools are open and functioning. Specifically to the 11 Robert Moses era Olympic pools, we're very pleased that 10 of those 11 pools have served their function as public pools and outdoor cooling spaces since the day they opened in 1936 to 1937, and have served that purpose ever since. Only one pool, the pool in Mccarran, was closed, but that was reopened earlier in the last decade after a $65 million renovation. So basically the 11 hallmark landmark pools are still serving their function today. We are very excited at Parks because along with our partners at the Central Park Conservancy, we're entering into a new era of pools where we are currently the Lasker pool in the Harlem near in the northeast corner of Central Park is currently being demolished and will be replaced by a new $150 million Harlem near center pool, which will be much more than a pool. It will be an ice rink in the winter and passive lawn space in the spring and summer, the shoulder seasons. But it is the first new pool that New York City Parks has built from scratch of that size in close to 50 years. So with that as a little background, again, thank you very much for engaging New York City Parks now for the second year in this study. Very interested in hearing today's presentations. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Mark. So we're a bit ahead of schedule, which I think is going to be great because it'll give everybody a bit more time in the first panel. So without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Professor Addison Godell, who is the coordinator of the second year Architectural History and Theory sequence. So we've been working together talking about this as well as our overall second year kind of undergraduate education. So I'm pleased and very excited to give it over to him to moderate our first panel. Thank you, Addison.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased and excited to welcome these wonderful guests that you've organized here. This is looking like a great event and very interesting to me personally, but I think also for the school as a whole, and certainly for the second year students. To move quickly to introducing our panel, first, Marta Guttmann is an architect, historian, and educator, currently serving as the interim dean at City College's Spitzer School of Architecture, where she has long coordinated the history and theory program in tandem with her work on the doctoral faculty at the CUNY Graduate Center. Many in today's audience will know her scholarship first through the fantastically informative essay, Race, Place, and Play, Robert Moses and the WPA Swimming Pools in New York City. An essential starting point for our conversation today and for the ongoing work of the second year undergraduate studio. This article also represents a larger bibliography focused on many things, including, I would say, urban spaces of children's education and recreation at the intersection of architecture and policymaking, highlights of which include the volume Designing Modern Childhoods, History, Space, and the Material Culture of Children, co-edited with Ning de Koning-Smith, and the multiple award winnings, A City for Children, Women, Architecture, and the Charitable Landscapes of Oakland, 1850 to 1950. I can't think of anyone better suited to open an event like this, so we are delighted and fortunate to begin with her perspective. Please join me in welcoming, well, if we were live, it's the habits, please join me in virtually clapping and welcoming Dr. Goodman.
So thank you very much, Addison, and thank you also Jonathan and Killian and our friends and colleagues at Pratt, speaking here from my uptown Manhattan home, not too far from my abode of the past almost 20 years, the Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York. So I am usually an architectural historian. Over the summer, I morphed into an interim dean. So this is a welcome. I'm very happy to serve my school, but this is a welcome return to my usual terrain, which is thinking about history. And I thank you for those generous comments, Addison. I hope this presentation isn't too repetitive for your students who I understand are familiar with my article from the JSAH, but we'll go from there. What to say? All right, so shall we just begin? Is that great? All right, thanks. So let's see if we can make this work. Share screen. Is it? Oh, there it is. Share. All right. This is when your whole life becomes visible to the world, right? On the sorry. All right, here we go. So I will read my presentation, and this is in the interest of time and clarity. So again, thanks to all for inviting me and even more to speak to you and share my thoughts with you. And even more importantly, thanks for opening a conversation on infrastructure that is so important right now in our world. So on June 24th, 1936, thousands of cheering New Yorkers gathered on the Lower East Side to celebrate, excuse me, the opening of this new public swimming pool in Hamilton Fish Park. It was the first imprint in a $10 million public works project that by the end of the summer modernized the aquatic landscape across the city. Funded by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA pools opened once a week, starting in Manhattan at Hamilton Fish Park on the Lower East Side. Then in Queens, where the Astoria Park Pool and Bathhouse opened in conjunction with the Triborough Bridge and Athletic Complex on Randall's Island. And just to share a personal note, this is the pool where I learned to swim as a child. Then in Staten Island, where Tompkinsville Pool was built near the railroad tracks. Then in the Bronx, in Crotona Park, and finally in Brooklyn, where the new recreation center, the last to open in the summer of 1936, was located in a new public park and adjacent to Red Hook houses, all built by the WPA. By the end of the summer, 11 new pools had been built, one had been renovated, and more than 1,790,000 people swam in them. 600,000 were children under 14, attracted by the free swims on weekday mornings. So Robert Moses, the Parks Commissioner, worked with Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia to bring this grand civic improvement to fruition in record time. Fortune magazine touted the achievement as, quote, a conspicuous dividend example of the social dividend, close quote, pledged by President Franklin D. Roosevelt for the New Deal. The photo of Moses that illustrated the Fortune article showed him to be a model public servant of his time, smiling in shirt sleeves, very successful, with important WPA projects highlighted on the map behind him. And the new parks are highlighted in red on this map. So the New Deal, oops, excuse me, I changed that too quickly. The New Deal remade New York City, as Mason B. Williams explains in City of Ambition, FDR, LaGuardia, and the Making of Modern New York. And this summary is drawn from the excellent review of Williams's book in the New York Times. So the Public Works Administration spent $58 per capita in New York City. It's about $1,000 today, which was triple the per capita figure in Philadelphia or Detroit. The spending of the Works Progress Administration, which replaced the PWA, made up 31.4% of the municipal budget in 1937. And that spending meant that during the heyday of the New Deal, more than 1 in 11 New York City workers had worked for the New Deal, either directly or on a WPA project. So, friendly visage aside, Moses had no qualms about manipulating and even flouting the convention of democratic politics to achieve his goals. In 1938, Moses succeeded in nullifying a proposed amendment to the New York State Constitution that would have allowed the state government to battle racial segregation and discrimination in the private sector. This ugly side of the Moses phenomenon, stressed by Robert Caro in The Power Broker, leads to the serious charge that Moses was motivated by anti-Blacks and anti-Latinx racism with respect to the magnificent pools that you've just seen. And these were questions, Caro's assertions were ones that were questioned in the project I collaborated on, Robert Moses in the Modern City, The Transformation of New York, and that I went on to explore in the article that you've all read. So as you know, Caro targets these pools. Thomas Jefferson Park Pool on the left in Italian East Harlem, and Colonial Park Pool on the right in what whites called Black or Dark Harlem in the 1930s. I agree that with Caro, that Moses was a racial conservative. He endorsed separate and equal as a practical political philosophy, but Caro's charges of deliberate segregation do not hold up under close scrutiny of the physical city. So this morning, I'll share the revisionist perspective on swimming, race, and architecture that I developed in working on Robert Moses and the Modern City, a jacket I just showed you a minute ago, and that is important to share again in light of the renewed calls for racial justice in our country, already referred to this morning. I'll compare these pools to show how centralized planning and standardization made separate and equal a tangible reality for children in neighborhoods hard hit by the Depression. In addition, I'll show that some of the new WPA pools were racially integrated in the 1930s and 40s, which is not discussed at all by Caro in his seminal work. So the impact of New Deal reform on children and recreation in New York City was exceptional, given that Black and white children benefited unequally from WPA programs in other cities. Yet Jeff Wildsey, the author of A Social History of Public Pools, uses this poster as proof that the color line divided pools in New York City. In some neighborhoods it did, but his reading misses other important points. And the first is that both Black and white children were welcome in the instructional program, and thus in the water of at least some city pools, the Learn to Swim campaign that this poster advertises. In addition, and in defiance of racist stereotypes, Black and white youngsters are shown to be clean and healthy and to benefit equally from public programs intended to promote citizenship. John Wagner, a graphic artist working for the poster division of the Federal Art Project, another WPA program, designed it. So in other cities, whites succeeded in segregating pools, preying on racist fears of body contact, dirt, disease, and race mixing, a euphemism for interracial sex. In St. Louis, this pool in Marquette Park and another one in Fairgrounds Park set the standards for the pool building craze that swept across the US during the 1920s. However, the water quality in this and other progressive era pools was problematic at best. In St. Louis, swimmers swam in untreated river water at a time when raw sewage was routinely dumped in the boundary waters of cities. And as you see from the clipping, journalists highlighted attempts to purify water in public swimming pools. According to this summer, it took all summer, this article, sorry, it took all summer in 1931. And I would just say that the bathhouses that Jonathan showed us, the Sutro bath, the bathhouses, some of the bathhouses, other bathhouses shown in his presentation were full of untreated river water, water that was contaminated with raw sewage. So in New York City, kids swam in polluted water, river water, and cooled off in fire hydrant spray to cope with the heat. The first was dangerous. 450 people drowned in the city in 1934, and none were sanitary. Remember, this is a pre-vaccine era. Polio was just one of many diseases that kids could catch by swimming or playing in dirty water. So anxiety about dirt and disease was coupled with angst about adolescent sexuality. And in New York, more boys than girls swam. whether in the rivers or informally in rivers or in the new public pools. And the gender skew persisted in New Deal pools. Although parents did not always prevail in intergenerational conflict in immigrant families, domestic duties restricted the time all girls had for recreation, including for swimming. And I just would add that another strategy that Robert Moses took to address the questions of a contaminated river water was to build sewage treatment plants across the city. So the need for change was clear to Mayor LaGuardia, who appointed Robert Moses commissioner of the new citywide Parks Department right after he took office on January 1st, 1934. By the summer, the new Moses team had developed a plan to build 23 pools across the city. That's within 6 months this plan was made. And it was announced in the Times and illustrated with a model design rendered by the architect, Theo Kautsky. And in the end, the scope of work was cut back, but the achievement was nonetheless astonishing. And so as I explain in my written work on this subject in rather more detail, I emphasize that the key to success was standardization. In fact, that was the key to success across the New Deal, by all the New Deal projects. By this term, I mean standard components and construction details, not design, because each pool was a unique work of public architecture. And to summarize, the Parks Department team developed a standard bathhouse design, a standard site plan with 3 in-ground reinforced concrete pools, the largest used for swimming, the smaller ones for wading and diving, standard construction details and mechanical systems, including for water treatment, and a standard attitude toward location. To avoid delays, the pools were sited on available open space and near civic amenities, usually dating to the Progressive era. And I would just add that in addition to the standardization, the people working on all of these projects were people who were employed, landscape architects, engineers, who were employed by the WPA funds. So not only were the WPA funds used to build, they were also used to hire out-of-work professionals. And when you look at the drawings, the original drawings, which are all on file in the Parks Department archives, you can see by virtue of the last names, the ways in which an immigrant workforce was peopling the arts department. What's less clear is how gender integrated that workforce was. That's an unstudied topic waiting for someone to plow in to that work, to that archive. Okay, so let's turn to our comparison, and I show you both parks highlighted on the aerial photo. We're starting at Jefferson Park because this pool was rendered notorious by the charge in the power broker that Moses ordered the water unheated deliberately for racist reasons. And according to an aide, he believed Puerto Ricans and African Americans dislike swimming in cold water. This person is reported to have stated, quote, while heating plants at other swimming pools kept the water at a comfortable 70 degrees, at Thomas Jefferson Pool, the water was left unheated, close quote. And this charge has been interpreted to mean either that the mechanical equipment was not used or that mechanical equipment was not provided to heat water for swimmers. So I do not dispute white control of Jefferson Park Pool, buttressed white racial privilege in East Harlem. However, the former interpretation of the nasty story about water temperature is not seconded by other sources, and the latter is refuted by the design of the pool. So the siting of the new pool integrated WPA architecture into the reform landscape of an earlier time. The small park that was opened during the Progressive era in the part of East Harlem called Little Italy, and that Italian immigrants claimed and defended as their territory before the new facility was built. In 1930, 78% of East Harlem residents were foreign-born, with waves of successive migration having rendered this community ethnically complex. As Robert Orsi has shown, during the Great Depression, Southern Italians, Puerto Ricans, and Southern Blacks became caught up in, quote, a desperate mapping of American identities based on gradations of skin color, close quote. And Lexington Avenue marked the edge of Italian and Black Harlem in 1930s. And as Orsi argues, if that boundary was crossed, it was done intentionally. with the transgressor fully aware that racial conflict would erupt when this border was violated. And so Stanley Brogram, the architect in charge of Jefferson Park Pool and Bathhouse, placed this new complex right in the middle of the park. Thronged with thousands on opening day, the pool won praise from the architectural critic Lewis Mumford, writing in the New Yorker as an example of sound vernacular modern architecture, and other critics applauded the use of simple materials simply disposed. So the monumental clarity of the above ground world was rivaled by the complexity of the underground world. And a system of filter beds, pipes, and other equipment assured clean, sanitary, and heated water at all sites, including at Jefferson. This is an example of the filter house at Astoria Park Pool, but the equipment was similar across all the sites. Clean water was usually part of the WPA vision for swimming, but heating water in outdoor pools used in the summer wasn't common. However, Moses insisted the amenity warm water be added to all of the New York pools. So the same points about design excellence hold for Colonial, now Jackie Robinson Pool in central Harlem. This pool was supposed to have been built in Mount Morris, now Marcus Garvey Park, but after the Harlem Uprising of 1935, the mayor changed the site to Colonial Park, which was inside the recognized territory of Black Harlem. On the evening of August 9th, 1935, LaGuardia visited the park with Moses and announced a new pool and recreation center would be built there. I would just say that after decades of neglect, Colonial Park, all the public parks in New York were in terrible condition. Colonial Park was especially so, at least in part because there was an underground stream that ran through this park and left it a muddy mess. So at least some WPA laborers were African-American. They're shown in these, one is shown in this photograph, and they rebuilt the park entirely, adding new playgrounds, a baseball diamond, other athletic fields, a band shell, and a dance floor, as well as the new pool and bathhouse. And Amar Embry II, Moses's favorite architect, produced a stellar design for the bathhouse and pool enclosure, coordinated architecturally with other buildings in the park. Much bigger than Jefferson Pool, the center accommodated 4,100 swimmers, and the two-story brick bathhouse recalled medieval and Roman architecture. So given the neighborhoods were built, it's not surprising that white kids swam in Jefferson and Black kids swam in Colonial pools. But the question remains, did Moses build these pools intentionally to imprint his racist vision on children and play on children and the city's public spaces during the New Deal? He explained his decision otherwise in a lecture at Harvard University in 1939, insisting that separate and equal was the pragmatic solution of a political conservative to what he called racial problems. And as I explained in more detail elsewhere, white boys routinely beat up Black boys, Blacks and Puerto Rican boys in East Harlem when they tried to swim at Jefferson Pool. On occasion, white swam at Colonial Pool, although others felt unwelcome. And one man told me in an oral history that, quote unquote, that wasn't our pool. So the line was hardening. We must remember, between Black and white in New York, even in the 1930s, even as this city became a more racially diverse and complicated place. And this is calling on the work of Matthew Fry Jacobson. So we could stop this discussion here at these two pools and a civil servant, a white civil servant, reluctant to integrate and unwilling communities. But that would leave analysis of this topic incomplete. That is, without mention of the WPA pools that were racially integrated during Moses's tenure during the New Deal. So the most interesting example is Betsy Head Recreation Center in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Another example of the decision to invest WPA dollars in a neighborhood park in need of repair and a community hard hit by the Depression. When Betsy Head Memorial Park opened in the progressive era, Brownsville, Brooklyn was a predominantly white, Jewish, working class neighborhood. By the mid-1930s, African Americans also called this community home. And the park, equipped with a pool and bathhouse in 1914, had been singled out in the regional plan as in need of improvement and was designed by Moses subsequently as in disgraceful condition. After fire reduced all to ruins in 1937, the Parks Department put the architect, John Matthews Hatton, the architect of Astoria Park Pool, in charge, and he produced this extraordinary building. The new bathhouse with the requisite 3 pools opened in 1939. So at first, I believed that the informal rules mentioned by Christopher Legree when I met him at the park segregated the pools in the 1930s. And his stories were seconded by reports of racial exclusion in the park in Wendell Pritchett's excellent book, Brownsville, Brooklyn, and this 1941 article in Architectural Record. The photos taken by a young Samuel Gatto, who went on to extraordinary fame as an architectural photographer, show the pool full of white New Yorkers. And of course, Gatto was employed by the WPA. Okay, so the article celebrated the architectural quality of the facility, calling attention to the daring cantilever canopy supported by 8 parabolic arches clad in aluminum that covered the roof deck stadium of the sleek new bathhouse. So you can imagine my surprise when I realized that Gatto photographed the pool on July 14th, 1939. All the photographs are in the Library of Congress archive, not in 1941, and took many, many more images than were published. They give a very different impression of space and society in the Brownsville Pool, one in keeping with the progressive politics that Pritchett reports survived only for a time and among some people as Southern Black migrants moved into a left-wing Jewish community. So in this pool, racial integration and experimentation with gender norms and sexuality were not mutually exclusive. Gatto shows the pool to be not only a place where children played, but a center of courtship, spectacle, and display, where the sons and daughters of white immigrants, of immigrants tried out and on new Americanized selves. More to the point of this essay, of this presentation, the unpublished photos show the pool at Betsy Head Park was racially integrated. Black and white kids lined up at the entry, separated by sex, as was common practice as they entered into the separate locker rooms in the bathhouses, but not by race. In fact, the children seemed relatively indifferent to this issue. So their familiarity with one another is seconded by stories of racial integration, especially in boys' team sports at this park. As astonishing are photos that show the park department condoned racial tolerance and, dare I say, supported it by integrating the lifeguard staff. Is this situation an example of flagging? Caro used the term to describe the hiring of white lifeguards at Jefferson, reportedly at Moses's insistence to dissuade Blacks from swimming there. Perhaps the reverse happened at Betsy Head, a tacit recognition of a different social situation. And one that also existed in these pools too, in the 1930s and into the 1950s in New York. And one of the sources for this information the Parks Department has in its archives, films, early movies that were taken of children and adults swimming in all of these pools. They're great, great resources. So I just would emphasize that in other American cities, the prospect of racially integrated swimming sparked violent protest. In St. Louis, the WPA pools were separate and not equal and racially segregated by law. Maplewood Pool on the top left was one of 2 white-only municipal pools built in St. Louis County with WPA funds. In the city proper, this WPA helped build Tandy Recreation Center on the lower left in a Black neighborhood. It had a small indoor pool, not a big outdoor one. And some federal money was allocated to improve outdoor pools, including at Fairgrounds Park, and African Americans pressed for access, leading to the infamous incident in 1949 when white teenagers attacked Black boys trying to integrate the pool. The story made national news, with Life magazine giving full play to the brutality of white teenagers and endorsing the mayor's solution. he closed the pool and reinstituted racial segregation at other sites. 1 year later, when the city complied with a federal court order to integrate, the mayor opened the pools to boys and girls on alternate days to alleviate what Joseph Heathcote has called white fears of sexual mixing of the races. So clearly, there are many stories to tell about the WPA swimming pools, the great new spaces of public informality built across New York City during the New Deal. In East Harlem, Central Harlem, Brownsville, and other neighborhoods, hundreds and thousands of boys and girls flocked to these stellar works of public architecture, examples of the New Deal vision of the modern city and of modern childhood. Was this pragmatic liberalism unique to New York? I think so. I'm quite sure I think so, but it sadly existed only or persisted during the New Deal, perhaps in some small way through the post-war period. Although the WPA pools remained treasured recreational resources among children and teenagers in a city that sadly lacks enough resources for them through the present day, support for racial integration waned in the neighborhoods discussed this morning. And so during the 1950s, fistfights broke out between young men on the pool decks and in the locker rooms at Highbridge Park Pool, especially when racial divides were crossed in teenage dating. And this pool was so highly valued that teenage gangs fighting over turf in Washington Heights committed a terrible murder in it, or a terrible murder resulted from those battles. Michael Farmer, a teenager with one leg hobbled by polio, was murdered one evening. And this is a tragedy that Rob Snyder has written eloquently about in his book on Washington Heights. Similar disputes happened between whites and blacks at Mccarran Park Pool and Puerto Ricans and Italians at Jefferson Pool. And so in closing, I'd like to return to the points made at the beginning of my presentation. The first and most obvious point is that Caro's charges do not hold up under scrutiny of the physical city. The biographer's focus on personality comes at great cost. It distracts us from the spatial and structural dynamics of racism, one of the points that's remade repeatedly again and again in the protests surrounding the murder of George Floyd. Yet it is important to that is the need to attend to the structural and spatial dynamics of racism. Yet it's important to set the record straight. It's more important to recognize that racism is more powerful than any one individual, even a man as powerful as Robert Moses. The Coldwater story is reprehensible, but the flip side of it is to suggest that heating the water would have mitigated race prejudice at Jefferson Park Pool. And my argument is that water temperature was more or less a trivial matter in the face of routine violence used to halt racial integration of public swimming pools in working class neighborhoods across America, routine violence executed by children on other children. The second point is the need to insert race, childhood, and architecture into the history of the New Deal. This is an important project in and of itself, and one I think that your studios are undertaking. It's also useful to imagining routes to a more democratic, anti-racist future. The skeptics may doubt the New Deal vision of urban recreation and modern childhood, especially the intent to link space, place, play, and citizenship. They argue play is better left alone, because play mirrors reality, it reflects the state of society. I've drawn remarkably different conclusions. No space is intrinsically free, but modern architecture was a key mechanism for shaping a better social world during the New Deal. Some kids, these kids, took a chance at the new pools. Historical actors in their own right, Black and white boys and girls swam together in neighborhoods where progressive New Yorkers worked to make racial integration a matter of fact in daily life, not only an abstract principle. In magnificent new places, children cut across gender, age, and racial lines in progressive ways, showing that democratic citizenship could grow through their play during the WPA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guttmann. It's a wonderful introduction to this topic, and I think also really highlights, and I know we'll move shortly to introducing our next presenter, but really highlights something I've appreciated in your work, which is looking at these both in terms of their intentions and their design, but also in their actual social use. And thinking of your recent work on Intermediate School 201 in Harlem, and following the work of Henri Lefebvre, that space is created through contestation, through its social use, and can be detoured, can be reprogrammed, can be pushed and pulled in different ways. And I think that's really helpful for us. And we'll come back to this, I think probably in the panel. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for reading my chapter.
Oh, it right up my alley. I can't say enough about it. But I should looking at the clock, I should turn to our second presenter. Karolina Cicek is a practicing architect and teaches at Yale and Penn. Her firm, Only If, based now here in Brooklyn, has been recognized in a number of venues for their work ranging from interior design to architecture to the urban scale. For example, and I think quite relevant to the issue of infrastructure in New York, they collaborated with the Regional Plan Association on design proposals for 25 intermodal stations and neighborhood nodes along the long proposed and still much dreamed of Triborough RX transit corridor, which, if for those unfamiliar, if implemented, would use existing freight lines to link neighborhoods from Sunset Park through central and northern Brooklyn to Astoria to Hunts Point and on from there to Co-op City. Her ongoing public pools research project, public-pools.com, has cataloged the city's dozens of public pools and is building out a collection of related texts, drawings, and photographs in order to explore the pool typology's various formal, social, and cultural transformations over time. Her recent series of articles for Urban Omnibus draws on this research, as well as interviews and collaborations, including with some of our other esteemed guests, to introduce the issue of social equity and embedded in the designs of these projects and at different moments, different pool types at different historical moments that, again, I think sit directly at this intersection of architecture and policy. And so if anyone here has not reviewed that series at Urban Omnibus, strongly recommended. Thank you so much for joining us, Karolina Cicek.
Thank you, Addison, and thank you, Jonathan, for your invitation. Thank you, Marta, for a great presentation. I should say that Marta was kind of an inspiration and kind of contributor to my research and to the text. So I'm always looking out to hear more from her as for the others who will be presenting today. Just to qualify my presentation, I'm an architect and designer. I'm not a historian, but I'm using a kind of research, history, mapping, and cataloging as a way to understand the kind of larger patterns. Specifically, if we talk about pools and the kind of policy related to pools in order to kind of create, and this is kind of an ongoing process, a kind of potential solutions, ideas, and designs for how we should treat and kind of expand on existing infrastructure or propose the new one. So I will share my screen, and similarly to Marta, I will read at the expense of, for the efficiency and accuracy of the presentation. So just let me know if you can see the full screen.
Right now, it's the PowerPoint or the PDF with the slides down the left-hand side.
Does that work better?
There you go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the public pool research kind of aims to critically address larger questions about how cities and landscapes are formed, and how they will adapt and change in the future, and how we live collectively. This approach to look at the city and architecture when applied to New York City water system starts to reveal stories and undercurrents that may have been otherwise overlooked if policy, engineering, architecture, and other disciplines were studied without disciplinary overlap. The more layered, private, and public roles that water infrastructure plays in urban landscape tend to escape wider conversation. Public pools, water splashes, drinking fountains, public bathrooms, hydrants are all critical infrastructures of health, hygiene, and public space. The New York City is known for having one of the cleanest and more reliable municipal water sources in the US. Urban growth and increasing demand for clean water have driven the evolution of New York City complex water supply system over the past 200 years. In the 1820s, city officials decided to create a public water system to replace an unhealthy and unreliable network of collection ponds and cisterns, pictured here. The Croton Reservoir, Croton Dam, and Croton Aqueduct were opened on July 4th, 1842 to provide a flow of fresh water to Manhattan. Water was carried over the Harlem River via the High Bridge, which also served as a pedestrian promenade. Once it's reached the city, the water was stored in a series of artificial reservoirs distributed across various neighborhoods. The endpoint of the old Croton Aqueduct, the Murray Hill Reservoir, was considered the public face of the Croton system, and it was designed as a two-chamber, 24 million gallon structure in an Egyptian revival style. And its perimeter was topped by a public promenade accessible by a series of staircases from the street level. And as you can imagine, it was a kind of popular destination of that time. The city's local reservoirs were decommissioned with the completion of the new first and second water tunnels in 1917 and 36 respectively. The site of the Murray Hill Reservoir, for instance, was later transformed into Bryant Park, and part of the old reservoir's foundation were used to construct the new public library in 1911. The High Bridge Reservoir, for example, was adapted for a public swimming pool during the WPA era. Today, DEP operates two tunnels that supply New York City with 1 billion gallons of water each day. There is a third tunnel under construction. Beyond office and residential tap water connections, water also flows to some 100,000 hydrants, 1,000 public bathrooms, 800 spray showers, 3,000 drinking fountains, and 63 active public pool complexes in New York City. DEP also operates 965 sampling stations across the city, which are monitored daily to ensure water quality in a city. If water is considered a shared asset and connective tissue, the pool acts as a vehicle of its collective experience and connects the conversation about water supply to the question of policy, public space, recreation, and social interaction. 63 public pools located throughout 5 boroughs, ranging from outdoor Olympic-sized structures to miniature and best pocket sized sites and indoor facilities, are a kind of collection that I created over the past couple of years, mapping and also photographing them, as you will see moving forward. The seemingly neutral network of recreational facility has served as a backdrop for both celebration and disputes, reflecting larger dynamics around class, gender, race, and equitable access to public space and public health. The New York City has seen 3 major periods of pool building, shaped by both the social forces and significant political figures of their times. Facilities from both eras still reflect these legacies, even as contemporary challenges and ideas present new possibilities for these now historic spaces. With the construction and expansion of the water supply system, private bathrooms became commonplace for middle and upper-class New Yorkers. However, access to fresh water was still limited for the majority of working-class people. Since 1870, New Yorkers had relied on floating pools in East and Hudson rivers, public bathhouses, and natural bodies of water to maintain personal hygiene, do laundry, cool off, and swim. In 1895, the New York State Legislature passed a law mandating the establishment of public baths for all cities with more than 50,000 people in the state. Inspired by European examples, baths provided public showers, taps, laundries, and comfort stations or restrooms, And baths sometimes doubles or often doubled as a kind of recreational destination. Some were even located within the city parks and were equipped with gymnasiums and swimming pools. As the proliferation of private plumbing diminished their function as a public utility, the baths continued to offer relief during the summer heat. Some of former baths still survive to this day as indoor public swimming pools and recreational centers, like Astor Levy Bath in Manhattan or Metropolitan Bath in Brooklyn. But some of them since then took on new function as office buildings and other programs. On July 2nd, 1936, thousands of New Yorkers attended the opening of Astoria Pool with appearances from Mayor Hilary LaGuardia and Parks Commissioner Robert Moses. The pool was the largest of 11 public swimming facilities open across New York City that summer. Built with funds from the Work Progress Administration, the pools, like this one and all other WPA era pools, basically reshaped the public landscape in New York City. Moses's pool building ambitions departed from space for safe swimming, social gathering, and much needed recreation. They created a new kind of public architecture reflecting progressive policies and evolving approach to recreation and gender integration in the public space. And we had amazing discussion with Marta Guttmann, who was also saying the pools can also be considered a kind of place of the feminist awakening, which is a kind of super interesting thread to also be researched and kind of continue on. The pools became the social melting pots and places to be seen. But the pool buildings could democratize access to swimming to a degree. While modern pool facilities allowed for mixing of different classes and genders, they also amplified racial prejudice in society. Robert Moses followed a separate but equal approach to siting pools, distributing facilities across different racially segregated neighborhoods. And many facilities remained racially segregated through social practice. The second pool building era in New York City occurred during John Lindsay's tenure as mayor, and after stepping down of Robert Moses from his post as Parks Commissioner. Public pools built in the late 60s and 70s significantly differed in form, size, distribution, and underlying social and urban policies from the earlier WPA era facilities. Unlike Moses, who observed the city from the perspective of a speeding car, Mayor Lindsay was famous for his walks through often overlooked neighborhoods. Where Moses saw a great mass that needs to be bathed, needs to be aired, and needs recreation, Lindsay saw people and believed in the betterment of the individual to improve the society. John Lindsay's term coincided with the heightened unrest in the city and the country, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War protests. Mariana Mogilevich, who is the author of the recent publication, The Invention of the Public Space, The Designing for Inclusion in Lindsay's New York, and editor-chief of the Urban Omnibus, who also very generously contributed to my work for them, said that there were a lot of experiments in new and improved public spaces. There was a lot of spending on cultural and recreational programming across the city, and not just in places that predominantly, usually white, that had been funded before. The small scale of this intervention was about getting things into neighborhoods at the scale of the block, decentralizing and redistributing and getting things to where they haven't shown up before. It was faster and cheaper to build and avoided the large-scale demolition and displacement associated with urban renewal projects. During the hot summers of the 60s and 70s, the pools and other water infrastructures meant to help literally and figuratively keep the city cool. The first of Lindsay's pools were portable structures that could be dismantled and moved to other parts of the city. They also took the form of swim mobiles or pools mounted to tracks that would circle around neighborhoods that were usually in underserved areas. The city subsequently began to install more permanent structures, the mini pools, with completely standardized dimensions, 20, 40 by 3 feet. They were usually built on vacant lots in neighborhoods suffering from disinvestment. Although a very, very ambitious in numbers, the fast deployment and strategic reuse of existing vacant space, the mini pools were too small for real swimming and not equipped with changing rooms and other facilities. Their construction was quickly phased out, and the city started to build larger vest pocket pools in the early 1970s. This unit features uniformly sized swimming and wading pools made out of prefabricated modules that were arranged differently depending on the site that they were to inhabit. The vest pocket pools were often located next to or within parks or in densely populated areas without other access to recreational facilities. In 2018, the Parks Department initiated the Cool Pools program, which involved the renovation of selected vest pocket park pools that had not been significantly upgraded until since 1970s, kind of promoted the schools back as a place not only for recreation, but also social gathering and spending the free time for city's kids. There were also two larger pools constructed during the Lindsay administrations that include the Kostuszko Pool, which is actually my neighborhood pool in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and also my favorite pool architecturally, and the Marcus Garvey Park pool in Harlem. The design and construction of Kostuszko Pool was commissioned to Morris Lapidus, a Miami-based architect of luxury hotels and pools, who actually happened to grow up in that very neighborhood and was very kind of keen on taking that commission in a place that lacked any other water and public space resources. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote about this pool, quote, "There is a handsome new municipal swimming pool in Bedford-Stuyvesant called the People's Pool. What God built its large reinforced concrete complex of swimming, diving, and wading pools with torches of color and bright blake that tries to show, in spite of overwhelming necessity and visibility of its vandal-proof construction, a sensitivity to people and place." And those are the kind of recent photographs that myself and photographer Anna Mordovich took of the pool. It was not until 1964 that Title III of the Civil Rights Act legally desegregated public facilities, including pools, and not until 1968 that the Fair Housing Act legally banned housing discrimination in the United States. These policies exacerbated the retreat of white population from public swimming facilities to backyard pools and private clubs. In her recent book, The Sum of Us, Heather McGee describes the extreme example of the Municipal Recreation Department, zoo, and public pool in Montgomery, Alabama, all being shut down or closed following court-enforced desegregation of the city recreational facilities in 1959. She says, quote, "The council decided to drain the pool rather than share it with the Black neighbors. Of course, the decision meant that white families lost public resource as well." Unquote. Urban pools and other public facilities across the country fell into this ripple. In New York City, the dynamics of those described by McGee led to closure of the Mccarran Park Pool in 1984. After a period of abandonment and threats of demolition, local artists brought the pool back to life through live performances, paving the way for its eventual reuse and open-air concert venue until 2008. The first discussions about renovating the Mccarran Park Pool were already circulated in late 70s and early 80s, but at the time, the Mccarran Park Pool area had a very different demographic. It was dominated by mostly Polish and Italian immigrants who were not open to swimming with neighbors from nearby African American and Dominican communities. The pool was landmarked in 2007, renovated and reopened for swimming in 2012 with the efforts then the Parks Commissioner Adrian Benetti, who was responsible for overseeing the renovation. And by then also demographics has shifted and welcomed a significant number of people who now saw the pool as an asset rather than a threat. The last public pool built in New York City was the Floating Pool Lady, an initiative of a planner, Ann Buttenweiser, and the Neptune Foundation that was very much inspired by the floating baths from the 19th century. And after docking at several temporary locations along the Brooklyn riverfront, the pool, which is built into retrofitted barge, was kind of found its permanent home, although not really designed as such to be parked in Bronx. More recently, the city's Economic Development Corporation has given permission to proceed with due diligence of the construction of the Plus Pool, the result of a 10-year campaign supported by Plus Pool nonprofit, architects, private individuals, and public authorities to build a floating swimming facility on the East River. I'm not going to go into detail because I think Oana is going to talk about that in the afternoon. What I wanted to highlight now is that during the summer months, New Yorkers rely on kind of shared public water facilities to beat the heat and recreate and socialize. But even with the network of existing water feature and with roughly one pool complex serving every 160,000 New Yorkers, they're all too scarce cooling source in a city where the heat vulnerability reflects the racial economic disparities. With the closure of pools last year, especially that was visible last year, with the closure of pools, beaches, playgrounds, and spray showers, people turn to swimming in unprotected natural bodies of water for cooling and recreation, which brought back concerns of public safety. There are also many super interesting initiatives like the Red Hook area where people really try to kind of find other ways to use water for cooling and kind of surviving the heat. The history of public pools in New York City traces the reciprocal relationship between architectural invention and policymaking. In light of the recent and hopefully receding COVID crisis, along with the growing and interconnected impacts of inequality and climate change, pools potentially have new critical role to play in the urban environment. Pools can take on novel function, whether through adjustments of their physical footprint or expanded programming. Facilities that operate only a fraction of the year could open their doors to other functions and users during off-season times, offering more permanent space for social gathering, education, and health. And with every summer seemingly getting hotter than the last, the need for expanded water infrastructure will be critical for making sure that New Yorkers can continue to keep cool when it really matters the most. Such overdue changes require an integrated social and spatial approach to addressing both the immediate and long-term needs of the communities that public pools serve. How might we use water infrastructure as catalyst for building social and urban resilience in the future? Can water, once again, become a connective tissue that defines development models for the upcoming decades? And with that question, I will leave it open for discussion.
Thank you so much. Really, really helpful to now situate these WPA era pools, which are the main subject of this panel, with the later history of pool construction in the city. And on a personal note, I'm also preoccupied or obsessed with the Kosciuszko pool, as well as the modular vest pocket pool architecture by Heery and Heery. And I'm very glad to see those on the screen, and they offer, I think, a range of models for the students, for our students to consider, but also for thinking about the role of a pool. What is a pool? Why do we have them? We want to turn to questions from the audience. I will attempt to mount some preliminary prompt and some kind of question of my own, maybe more prompt than a question, to get things going while people gather their own thoughts. Looking across both of the presentations, I'm struck by many things. One is thinking about the role of these pool complexes in the New Deal as both kind of functional recreational centers for immediate neighborhoods, and also as kind of statements or symbols or really monuments to a certain idea of the public, an idea of why a public space was important, or how the public would be constituted through recreation, through bodily activity, through water and sun and fun. And in connection with Mariana Mogilevich's book, which Carolina, you mentioned, which I've been reading this week, and so it's very much had the idea on my mind of different ways of defining the public and why it's important and how we get there. And I think it's very interesting that in this New Deal moment, but also as these pools remain as kind of objects of fascination and fixation, that the public is being created not merely through swimming, not merely through public pools, but through monumental facilities, right? That these are Roman-scaled bathhouses, really, versus a larger number of smaller pools, as was experimented with at a later time, or what Moses was doing with playgrounds, right? Just hundreds of them all over the place. And of course, there would be economies of scale in doing a smaller number of large pools. We can understand that. A similar decision was in fact made around the same time with sewage treatment plants, going from a vision of many, many small plants to a few really big ones, which of course heightens the issues of kind of environmental justice issues of where those are cited. And going beyond the practical, though, I mean, the creation of the monumental pool, and I think is really an interesting aspect of these. I think it's a reason why we're drawn to them. The imagery of these grand facilities with similarly grand, but in certain ways unpretentiously modernized or Art Deco architecture. These photos of them filled with hundreds or even thousands of people speak to perhaps a nostalgia for a certain era's, the New Deal conception of the public, or New York's attempts to create what I think it's Joshua Freeman who saw this as a project of creating a welfare state in miniature. Why, in other words, do they have to be so big? Why? What does that do? And what kind of public does that suggest, or what kind of public creation process that suggests? And do we find that same impact in the, let's say, medium-sized pools like Kosciuszko, like the Marcus Garvey pool, which have maybe a kind of wacky, fun-filled version of brutalist architecture? Does that architecture serve a different, does it create a different public, or is what matters more that the Lindsay administration was interested in public space for different reasons? We're trying to create a different public quality to these spaces. That's a lot of different threads, but I'm really prompting you to speak about scale and monumentality, and whether and how those things matter in creating the public through these pools. If that floats your boat, dive right in.
So, Carolina, you want to go, or?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Carolina, for that great presentation, and also for your amazing work. I spent hours with your drawings. They're wonderful. So I think, Addison, I heard three questions. Or three comments, one about neighborhood scale, one about the neighborhoods which were chosen to build the pools, speaking of New York now, one about relaxation and leisure, and then another one about monumentality. And so I think they're all in one way, in many ways kind of linked. But first, just to point out that no other city, part of the reason there's so many pools in New York City is because Moses, FDR, and LaGuardia, no matter how much they fought with each other, were able to cooperated in order to win millions of dollars for New York, right? So much so that the city was known as the 49th state. We were 48 states at that point, not 50 as later. So they just got oodles and oodles of money to come to fix the city. And so where most cities were lucky if they got one pool, right? New York got many, many, many pools. So I could stand in awe of their ability to manipulate public dollars, or direct the flow of public dollars to the city, and a flow of money that reconfigured the city in all of its aspects. With regard to, let's just start there. I mean, the decision to locate the pools in neighborhoods was in part driven by pragmatic. And the other piece to realize here is, with regard to the politics of this, is that no one knew how long the New Deal was going to last, right? No one knew how long federal money was going to continue to flow, and there were enormous battles in Congress to staunch the flow, in which very conservative Republicans battled the flow of New Deal dollars again and again and again. And so the question, you had to get as much money as you could and get it as quickly as you could because you didn't know, figure out how to build quickly and well, because you didn't know how long you were going to have these funds. And also there was so much work to do in the city, both with regard to, and principally remember that the purpose of the New Deal was to get people to work, right? That the idea was to restart the economy by employing out of work Americans, giving them money so that paying them so that they could start to buy things again. So this is the goal here is an employment project rather than necessarily a construction project. The construction is tied to employment. So all of this leads then to these decisions about standardization and pragmatics in decision making. And so the locations of the pools was driven very much by where there was public space to build, right? That if you could find a public park that had been opened, find a public park or find disused land along the waterfront or near railroad yards, then you could build a pool there, right? And there were no environmental reviews, there were no community boards, there was nothing to stop you, you could just do it. And they also wanted to build twice as many as they ended up building. So those are and so the neighborhood locations then become places, become the one where there are sites, where there's land, become a great driver in the decision to build. Moses wanted to build a pool in Central Park, and the other question here that comes in is who are these pools for? And the pools are built for working class New Yorkers. This is a working class project at its core. When Moses proposed to build a pool in Central Park, the wealthier people who lived around the park defeated that proposal. They just wiped it out. So it took until the 1960s for Lindsay to be able to overcome their objections and build the pool that the Parks Department is now rebuilding. And I think that's a very welcome move on the part of the Parks Department. That was not one of Lindsay's great contributions, in my view, architecturally. So we also, and so they were, why, you know, and they were built in neighborhoods where most apartments didn't have plumbing. I mean, didn't have bathrooms in which there was, you know, there were bathrooms that were inadequate. So that the pools actually added facilities that made it possible for working class people to get clean in ways I think that we find very, very difficult to comprehend. And I think Carolina's work really points out the importance of this kind of infrastructure. So coupled with that then coupled with those sets of bigger issues is the issue of leisure and recreation. And so it becomes, we have a sea change in the attitudes of Americans, one with regard to swimming, with regard to leisure, with regard to relaxation, with regard to having fun, and the New Deal pools capture that moment perfectly. So before the 1920s, Americans didn't swim; they just didn't. They started swimming in the 1920s, largely in Europe, and building on trends that had happened in Europe. And the architecture that was created in Europe, as well as in other cities, was monumental. And so New York didn't have any of those bathhouses. They weren't built in the city. For some reason, we were behind the times on that particular change. And so when the opportunity came to build, well, here were these New Yorkers, right? All of them saying, we're going to outdo everybody else, and we're going to make the best, biggest, most grand statements that show New York is at the top of its game. And that shows to New Yorkers that the New Deal is working for you, that these are your places, that you deserve this kind of public architecture, just like anybody, you know, the richer people deserve the Metropolitan Museum or the Brooklyn Public Library. That architecture is, that grandeur, that scale, that magnificence belongs to working class New York. So that's why I think it happened. And I think it worked, right? And then the pools, I talk about this and Carolina alluded and showed some wonderful photographs also recorded in the Parks Department's films about the ways in which the desire for spectacle, the desire for performance, the desire for showing the achievements of children, for all of the pools were great staging grounds, and for that kind of and the public was open because leisure and relaxation were no longer like they were in the 19th century, touted with Protestant notions of you're not working hard, you're not doing, that it was okay. It was okay to have fun. It was okay to be relaxed. It was okay to take the weekend off. And moreover, New Deal legislation made it possible to take the weekend off because it put in limited the amount of time and made the 5 day a week, 8 day a week work week possible. So there was time to enjoy yourself. So all of this feeds in, right? And I mean, I haven't even spoken about the ways in which children become the focus of political attention in this period, and how the new architecture becomes a staging site not only for adults to enjoy themselves, but for kids, and how that encapsulates and shows this new vision of childhood as something that every child is able to enjoy, the happy, the fun, the sports-filled or parks-filled childhood that up to the 1920s or so was something that was really reserved for middle and upper class people, but not by the 1930s. Children aren't, there are new labor laws, there are new school laws, there are new schools, there's all a new deal vision is in place. And we live with that vision now, very much so. And I would also say that it wasn't only the pools that were monumental. Look at the bridges, look at the parks, look at the parkways, look at the scale of public housing, the beginnings of public housing. It's all monumental. It's not a bit as modest. Does that come with limitation? Sure, yeah, of course it does. It's a characteristic of the period. One that I admire, I have to say. That belief in the public.
I see, Mark, you have your hand up as well, and then I'd love to hear from Carolina too.
Thank you, Addison. Just interesting, this conversation, and the fact that both you and Carolina have mentioned both K-Pool, as we call it, and Marcus Garvey. I think the WPA era pools celebrated people and their engagement with the architecture in the pools. You go to some of the spaces, the sequence of spaces are grand. The locker rooms, the changing spaces at Astoria are some of the largest interior rooms in any park building in the city. You go to Betsy Head and those spaces are bathed with natural light through the glass block windows on the east and west side. There was something really thoughtful about how those spaces, but then you move forward to the two pools you've mentioned, Marcus Garvey and K-Pool. Those are not particularly pleasant experiences for our patrons. They may be interesting architecturally, but the vast majority of people aren't looking at the architecture, they're looking at the experience. And particularly with K-Pool, you go down that ramp, you're underground, you go into locker rooms that are very low ceiling, have poor ventilation, no natural light. And it's the same way in Marcus Garvey, although it's slammed into the hillside, it really ruined that northern facing slope of that park. And those spaces, yes, the locker rooms are taller, but there's no natural light. So there was this, I'm not an architect, so I'm just speaking to how our public experiences it. In fact, that those are two of our most difficult buildings to maintain of our pool buildings. The cast in place concrete architecture of the 1970s is a bear to maintain and keep functioning. But I'm just saying that from a park patron experience, I would much rather go to any of our WPA era pools and have that experience of progression through those grand rotundas and the big naturally lit locker rooms and then out onto the generous pool deck, then go to a place like K-Pool or Marcus Garvey, where we've tried over the last several years to make aesthetic improvements to them, but we're never going to be able to change the core functionality of the architecture of those buildings, which are really brutal and not particularly appealing or hospitable to the users. Thank you.
So I just would add, Mark, to your point about the bathhouses and the WPA pools, the locker rooms were meant to be all of the furniture was movable. And so the intention was that every one of those rooms would be turned into recreation centers for for games and sports during the when the pools closed, right? Because the pools being outdoor pools were only open only in the summers. And so that is and there, we didn't have air conditioning at that point, right? Or certainly not for those kinds of facilities. So light, ventilation, windows that open, all that stuff was just part of the game, and it really endured. You know, I think at Betsy Head, the locker rooms are still used for off-season or so-called off-season sports games for like, as were the pools meant to be used. They were meant to be drained. When they were drained, they were meant to be used for team sports, and as they were. Anyway, it's Carolina's turn to talk.
No, those are all great points. And maybe as a designer, I'm gonna, of course, point out that I completely recognize the kind of pools as a kind of reflection of the times, or even architectural styles and a kind of design styles that were present where those pools were constructed. But very quickly, when I started drawing the pools and kind of comparing sizes and looking at kind of architectural styles, I realized that that's important, but what's more important were the policies that shaped them. And what was Marta was talking about, the kind of pools during the WPA era being a kind of big kind of, working class, for working class people project that was supposed to kind of embrace and kind of serve as many people as possible. And there is, of course, the kind of very kind of swift change into the kind of policy of Lindsay, where the kind of smaller pools, but quicker in deployment, and perhaps, I mean, of course, cheaper in also maintenance and basically construction, or even the fact that the kind of movable pools existed, was a kind of a question of policy, but also very quick reaction to the new needs of the kind of communities, changing communities, very kind of heightened unrest and kind of requests for the public also to access the water facility. So I think that's what's super interesting for me, also in light of the question, what's next? Maybe that's also the question to the Parks Commissioner. What are the policies now, and how now, looking at the kind of past pools, the ones that kind of, you want to say, aged well, meaning the WPA era pools, who actually can continuously absorb and kind of basically welcome functions the same as they had before, but also the new ones that are coming and occurring, and maybe perhaps less so pools that are maybe, the mini pools that are not necessarily like swimmable, but still very important asset, but limit the kind of engagement with water to like one or maybe two kind of aspects. And the kind of, as an architect, I would say beautiful, but as a kind of public may say brutalist pools that are kind of very stiff and maybe harder to work with, to kind of expand on what they were in the past, but what they could be in the future. So I think in terms of the scale and in terms of the kind of architecture, that's maybe one discussion. But I think program, for me as a designer, it's very important. And thinking of those facilities, both the existing ones or the new ones, like the Lasker pool that is being renovated, it's something that first works year round, two, that welcomes more than just recreational facilities. I mean, it's amazing. There is swim classes which have to do with safety, basically public safety. It's amazing. There is food served at those places, that there's a kind of, kind of food safety, but also education and other community resources that could be placed there, that the pools would, again, kind of continue or even more expand their role as a kind of cultural centers in the places that already have them. And, not to like bring up too many of the classical examples, but Roman baths had libraries in them. It was a place for political brokering. It was a place for also recreation and a kind of physical kind of exercise. But it was a place where you would go conduct business. It was a place where you would, and again, in Rome, not everybody you had to pay, etc. But just to say that I think I see always a pool as a kind of almost a community center, and a question of how that community is shaped. It's contested, as we saw in the presentations. But I think with expansion of the program and kind of understanding which community the pools exist in, and kind of taking from that, planning forward, they, I think, have a very important role in the urban fabric in New York City and other places.
So Addison, I can quickly answer that because I know we're on time here, but you know, let me just reference, there's been several references to renovating Lasker. Just to be very clear, we're replacing Lasker. Lasker being fully demolished. And as Dr. Guttmann said, you know, wasn't a good piece of architecture, blocked the Harlem Mere, the drainage area. So just to be clear for the audience that we're replacing it. And I think and I mentioned it in my opening comments, I do think the new Harlem Mears Center, which will be the name, is the prototype for future activity. It'll be a year-round facility. It'll be a pool for 10 weeks of the year. It'll be ice skating rink for how many weeks of the year. It'll then be open year-round, and the pool, the actual pool basin, which will also be the ice skating rink, will be filled in with a very innovative kind of structural platform, and then a synthetic lawn will be put down. So it just becomes a passive lawn space for, you know, kids to throw a ball around or something like that. But the building will be open 12 months of the year. It'll have public restrooms. It'll have food service in it. It'll be the new vision of what we believe public pools can be. I will say they do not come cheap. Again, that's going to be $150 million, and that's not because it's in Central Park. It's because that's what it costs to do these, and we're very fortunate in the fact that we could actually demolish Lasker. It's not landmarked. So when you think about inserting other year-round uses in any of the WPA era pools, it becomes an extraordinary challenge and for the students that are on this, as you witnessed when you toured something like Astoria with me, just the difficulty of getting any kind of disabled accessibility into Astoria, or in Betsy Head, getting anyone up to the roof deck now would require an elevator shaft punching up through the roof line of that building to get folks to reactivate that beautiful vista in that cool structure up top. So, for example, we're looking at just preserving the exterior envelope at Astoria, and that's probably a $100 million project just to restore the exterior envelope of Astoria because it's so large and it's historically designated. So I think the new Harlem Mere Center is the future. Whether or not we can achieve that at the historic designated WPA era pools is yet to be seen.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out all those problems. I would just, those issues and challenges, I think one of the great challenges that the Parks Department faces is it is partly as a result of my work and other people's work, is now the pools are the bathhouses are designated, and which creates all kinds of other challenges. That these are, and particularly with regard to ADA, what was countenanced as accessible in another era is no longer, and this is an issue for the experimental playgrounds that Datner and others designed in Central Park as well. And there are no easy solutions here, but the constitutionally guaranteed rights of Americans are constitutional rights, and in my view, they trump historic preservation at any moment, although they don't have to be necessarily seen as at conflict with one another. I think we can, that's a problem for architects to figure out. There's a question in the chat I'd like to answer, but before I do that, I just would like to add another comment to the great set of requirements that Carolina just offered us, or prompts for how we might think about the pools of the future. And that is to remember, and that is to say that pools are also sites of employment. There are sites of employment for the people who build them, for the people who design them, and the people who run them. And so, you know, in conjunction, as Jonathan mentioned to me when he invited me to join this symposium, that, you know, that the challenge to think about infrastructure in your studios and in your school, which I applaud enormously, is one that's prompted by the Biden program, by the Build Back Better program. So let's think of the build piece of that, right? And what building and building back better mean, and how we as architects and historians and public officials can join with economists and policymakers and the like to link our projects to thinking about labor. It's just so critical. That's the way we build coalitions. That was political ones, and that was a winning coalition and a winning argument in the New Deal. I mean, it was, of course, prompted by a huge economic crisis, but we you know, I mean, we could make those great monuments to the public, however perhaps problematic the definition of public was in certain area, because there was a public that was capacious at that point. I think it's very, very hard to think about that these days.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so those are, I just, you know, that the labor piece of this is so critical, and one that we are running a series on architecture and care, a lecture series at Spitzer this semester, and Elke Krasny, a brilliant thinker, spoke just the other night, and she was making a really powerful argument, making about how architecture and care are linked to one another through labor and design, and these, I think, are prompts that can be taken to think about recreation, the architecture of public recreation and water and the like. There's a question in the chat from Jonah Rowan, and I would, yeah, say absolutely that the pools were intended to inculcate working class kids into middle class social norms. I mean, the sequence of moving, the beautiful sequence of moving through the bathhouses that Mark has described so eloquently was one that was ridden with sanitarian goals, right? I mean, you had to check your clothes, you had to wear a city issued bathing suit and bathing cap. If your hair was long, you had to sanitize your feet in a lightly acidulated water. You had to take a shower. That's just one example of the ways in which sanitarian and middle class norms were not only made into policy, but actually experienced, you know, actually embodied. I think many of the athletic competitions, the swimming lessons, all the ways in which the directors and instructors of different programs were different kinds of uniforms, the emphasis that's all connected with you know, sort of Foucauldian regimes of normality, but normalizing, but just because they happened doesn't mean they were absorbed, right? You know, there's the performance, and then there's the internal questioning of it that goes on all the time. And I certainly came across stories, and maybe this still goes on, of all the underground tunnels that surround the pools through which the water is moved and the maintenance were made, that teenage kids figured out ways to get in them and use them for courting and dating. And you can imagine what else happened. And this was not only heterosexual encounter, right? So it was a multi-sexual encounters. So just because we decide that we insist that a certain intervention embodies certain kinds of norms, and those norms of practice, that doesn't mean they can be contested and used and manipulated in all kinds of ways that are really, from my point of view, really exciting to learn about. So.
That's great, and it's always struck me, and I think the historical record would bear this out, that the pools were also intended essentially as a kind of healthful competition with Coney Island, or with going to the movie theaters and other kinds of you know, working class amusements that, you know, someone like Moses, for example, would have not been aligned with, but absolutely, like, it's how these things are used, whether they are absorbed.
And he didn't succeed in reducing the attendance at Coney Island or movie.
Right, exactly, yeah. I think we could probably take, how are we on time? We could take one more question from the audience, or are we pushing it?
We are. We're going to, I would advise everybody to take if they're in need of a bathroom break, they should probably just walk away from the screen and take care of that. But I think we're going to roll pretty quickly into the next panel. But take the question. Go ahead.
Okay. Do we have a question? We have a comment. I'm scrolling back to make sure we didn't. Something. There's a great comment here from Meta about air conditioning, and that the long-term value of having cooling options that are not based on burning fossil fuels to power air conditioning, especially in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. I think that's very well taken. Any other questions? I have another comment on K-Pool, but I can save that.
Yeah, I think Meta's comment is excellent, and it is important to understand that when you look at who's using pools these days, at the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhoods in which many of these pools were located has changed, and so they're now serving the new New Yorkers, who enrich our city, right? And that's definitely a decision that we can, definitely a consequence of location, right? Of building pools in working class neighborhoods that are populated by the new people who arrive, the new Americans, and we continue to see that, right? And, just on the question of labor, I would say that this is where I would fault Lindsay's program, is that there wasn't a consciousness about labor. I don't believe, not in the same way that it's a point of disagreement I have with Mariana. And I think that we can talk, yes, about the ways in which the pool, there were community-based, small scale, mobile, really interesting and important innovations, but the arguments that those pools should also be linked to an employment project that was based in those neighborhoods, I don't think that happened. And that's where I think where certainly because of funding, because of policies, because the 1960s were not the 1930s, we lose that we can see definitely in this period that the New Deal coalition has started to fragment, and there are ways in which you can see that fragmentation affecting the ways in which the public realm, or let's just say public spaces in New York are being imagined and being constructed. It's not so much a disagreement with Mariana, it's really just an add-on to that point, one I've been thinking about recently. So.
Well, and that actually ties in very much with what I was thinking about K-Pool and thinking about the resources of the Lindsay administration versus the LaGuardia administration. Notwithstanding the ambitions of the Great Society, there simply was not the same massive influx of public works money, and specifically in the case of K-Pool, I think the sole kind of real architectural coverage of it is Huxtable's review in the Times, which focuses overwhelmingly on the architects' kind of exasperation with what procurement and the city, what they experienced of the bureaucracy of planning and implementation at that moment in time. Now, architects, of course, love to offer these complaints, and who knows of the exact details. It's something I would hope to research, but we do see in those projects the lesser means of that moment, which relates to inflation. It relates to the cost of labor. It relates to many things. One would hope that some future funding stream is found, perhaps to open those spaces up, to alter them, to serve a different definition of the public than was available to even the well-intentioned people in the Lindsay administration.
Mm-hmm.
Carolina?
I would just add one thing short, just following on that comment. And I know it's going to sound much easier than it is in reality, but I think that's why thinking about kind of, I would call it cross-pollination, right? Even if it's not only Parks Department, but Parks with education. And when the programming gets expanded, when there is a kind of mutual support and kind of collaboration, I think that's one way maybe to think about the kind of responsibility, funding, and other aspects. But also what Meta mentioned in her comment, thinking about the kind of climate, thinking about water not being a threat necessarily only in New York, but also a kind of place where you can, recreate, you can kind of promote a kind of healthy way of living, but also kind of a kind of civic engagement. And also a place, as we know, kind of sustainable sources, are potentially a big kind of labor poll now for our economy. I don't know exactly how that ties into pools, but I think there is kind of ways in which we should continuously look, like in the case of the Lasker pool, kind of creatively about how, maybe change the kind of typical ways in which pools have been done and how we can kind of propose new modes of operation for them, both from a kind of policy, but also design as a perspective.
I think that's really critical, what we're talking about, particularly in terms of the added parts of education or the other added pieces of program that these facilities can sponsor. Something that we're doing with second year is that part of their charge is to be inventive about an added piece that they're bringing, or an added programmatic identity that is both a district contribution as well as perhaps a thermal level thinking, so that we're cross-pollinating or we're cross-examining against climate and community impulse here. I do want to, I was going to save this for the end, but I think it's actually more appropriate for this group. So I do want to ask about a question about framing. Specifically, I really enjoyed, Marta, your phrase, public informality, or the kind of and I guess one of the questions that I keep coming about is, I think we're all agreeing that public informality is crucial, or is a crucial part of our community having that. And then the question that the architect has is, how do we form or frame public informality? And for me, that becomes a discussion back to some of these facilities, perhaps even the smaller ones, might be framed or discussed as more in a ground pursuit, or more, others might be in an object pursuit in some ways, as more edified or edifices. So I guess I'm curious, maybe Carolina, do you have thoughts in your survey on what are mechanisms to frame that lightning rod of social space, that frame the commons as these facilities have been used?
I think it's an interesting question, especially for somebody who actually comes from formerly communist state, actually, where the kind of, my experience of the pool was very related to the kind of sharing, to the kind of common ground, to common good, and the frame was just there, and there was no kind of need to kind of reframe or kind of define it. It was just a given for me. So I think in a way, when I arrived to New York City, what actually struck me that I heard much more about the kind of private pool than a kind of public pool, and maybe it's just my specific case, but just having that experience of a kind of attending public pool as a kid in a kind of small town in Eastern Europe as a kind of completely normal thing, typical activity, no matter of a class, kind of spurred the interest of the kind of publicness of pools here in New York City. And I think, you know, back to what was Marta was saying, you know, I very much admire the kind of grandiosity and a kind of belief of the kind of gesture of a large WP era pools as a way to engage the kind of working class community. And it was very clearly stated, as Marta was saying, that was the kind of people for whom the pools were built. I mean, everybody was welcomed, and we know that socially kind of things got segregated, but generally there was a kind of very clear message passed there. And I think similarly in the Lindsay administration, who was, as he says, a kind of follower of Jane Jacobs, he was kind of a fan of a kind of informality, fan of a kind of public performance, or a kind of public kind of occurrence on the street, a kind of local condition, and kind of engagement of public with the kind of built fabric of the city. And I think somehow all the pools in New York City were really kind of based on this kind of belief and a frame that they're for people, they're for everybody, they're kind of equally designed from working class to everybody in the Lindsay's era. And I think that's then important, is to see other layers that came to play, which is the race, which is the gender, and kind of understand that only kind of good ambition and kind of stating that kind of initial ideal, it might not be enough. And we actually have to kind of embed a little bit more in design or planning for those places in a way that they don't get kind of flipped or kind of taken over by other kind of forces in the society.
Received a question in the chat, or oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
You. Go ahead, Mark, please.
Oh, okay. There's something in the thread of the question or in these conversations that I'm not sure that I I'm grasping or that perhaps I don't agree with. It's that I think Dr. Guttmann said it earlier. I mean, this is presenting our pools as if they were built for a certain audience, a very wide audience in when they were built, these being the Olympic pools, the WPA era, Robert Moses pools, and that somehow they're not serving that way today. And I think very strongly differently that way. I mean, I do think they're serving everybody today. I'm not sure the thread of the conversation, and Carolina, some of your comments there, I'm not sure the thread of like who we're looking for to come to our pools. Everybody comes to our pools. I mean, I spend hundreds of hours during our pool season at our pools, and yes, they are reflective of generally the local population, particularly if you're talking about our intermediate pools, the 1971-72 pools. The larger pools have a larger draw, obviously, because there's fewer of them, but in Manhattan, because there's so many of the Olympic pools, they do kind of have a micro draw of the neighborhood. So yes, they serve a neighborhood, but they serve, so if the neighborhood has a narrow definition of what that population is, then that pool will reflect to that neighborhood, and it's not going to be a vastly diverse socioeconomic, cultural milieu. But they're reflecting the neighborhood, so they're still being used. And I've had many people approach me on our pool decks and say, "I've never been here before. This is an incredible pool. I never knew this was here." We try and improve the marketing every time, but I'm not sure. I feel our pools still serve the purpose that they were intended to serve when they were built, and I'm not sure that I'm feeling that reflected in these conversations.
I apologize if I gave that misinterpretation, because I agree with you completely, Mark. I think that what has changed is the character of the neighborhoods, but what endures is the capacity of the pools to serve the neighborhoods and also to serve a broader public. My concern is in thinking my concern about the public is about the public concerns the political public, and the ways in which the fracturing of our political conversation around Biden's infrastructure plans are a reflection of the let me say this a different way. And then in the 1930s, there was support for what FDR proposed, right? The country was in crisis. There was support, there was also opposition, but there was the support won. And from that support, which was grounded in a politics of employment, we were able to build the kinds of infrastructure that we are celebrating here today. What we don't have now is that constellation of political support for programs that are being offered in a spirit that I think is reminiscent of the New Deal, to do the kind of infrastructure work that we need to do. So that's my point. And I'm sorry if I didn't mean in any way to cast dispersion on the capacity of the pools that the Parks Department runs to appeal to a broad spectrum of New Yorkers. I think the Parks Department does an amazing job. And in fact, my comment to Jonathan on the question of public informality and the ways in which architecture works as a frame, I would urge architects to not be too specific, right? Because the New Deal pools are not that specific. They're standardized, they're general, they're grand. They had scripted norms woven into the architecture and woven into the policies, and yet look what happened, right? Look what happens. There's a capacity. Look what happened in the 1930s, and look what happens now. The architecture is general enough so that it can serve multiple publics and endure over a long period of time. So I think probably what's really critical, and this is what preoccupied Moses, is to think about the siting, about where are they located, how is land accrued in order to make this kind of architecture, and how can the architecture in the context of its time embrace multiple programs that serve the public, which did happen in the New Deal. Every piece of parkland that Moses claimed he had to replace with new playgrounds, or one of the reasons there's so many decks is the deck at Betsy Head was the argument that replaced the playground that was removed in order to build the pool. So that kind of thinking, I think, is that pretty fine grain and really, really attentive to siting is crucial. I also think that the collaboration between parks and education is another really fantastic point. And I would say in my new research on schools, it's one I'm looking at really, really closely with regard to schools, housing, schools, the Department of Education, Board of Education, then the Department of Parks and Recreation, and NYCHA, because the siting of playgrounds, the siting of schools, and the siting of public housing are integrally connected with one another. And yet the stories we tell about, particularly about public housing, don't talk about that at all. So this is such a rich conversation.
And I hate to cut it off because it has been so rich. I'm being told that for reasons of time we do have to move to the second panel. Although I think we could easily keep going. I do want to second Dr. Guttmann's comments just now to Mark, that I think that what Parks does is tremendous and is really unmatched, I think, in terms of what the city does provide its residents and how well used its facilities really are, enthusiastically and diversely programmed. And it's an incredible piece of a body of physical and social infrastructure. So thank you for that. And thanks so much to both of our presenters. I think this was really, really fantastic and put a ton of interesting issues on the table. So my apologies to the other questions that we won't be able to get to, but perhaps there'll be time at the end overall. So I will thanks you once again, and over to panel number 2.
Thank you, Addison. Can you guys hear me better? I switched microphone, maybe. Okay, good. So we are going to move on to our next panel, and as Addison said, we will have time at the end for more conversation if everyone can stick with us. And I think in some ways the next panel is kind of both kind of continue this history in the sense that we will now be talking about a little bit of what happened after the New Deal era in New York and some of the other things that may have been entangled with this discussion of race relations and how there might have been a separation. So and then we will perhaps conclude with optimism about new public formations today. So to that point, let me introduce our next 3 panelists. We are joined today by 3 fantastic presenters who will be presenting in 2 forms. So I'm going to start by introducing our first of our next panel, which will be, I have not actually, they're probably waiting in anticipation for me, and I apologize for that. We're going to be beginning with A.L. Hu and Nicholas Kemper, and who will be giving their presentation, which I anticipate will be the perfect bridge over. But let me start by introducing. A.L. Hu, AIA, is a queer, non-binary person who working in New York City. They are an Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellow and currently working as a Design Initiatives Manager at Ascendant Neighborhood Development in East Harlem. Hu is an activist working at the intersection of architectural labor and gender equity. Their research focuses on working with other people and communities to understand and rethink the architect's role in creating inclusive spaces. They are a member of, as well as conduit for, connecting various organizations, including the Architectural Lobby, Q-Space, Architects, and AIA New York. They have an M.Arch from Columbia University, as well as a B.Arch and minor in sustainability from the University of California, Berkeley. Nicholas Kemper is an editor and publisher of the New York Review of Architecture, for which he received a Graham Foundation grant in 2021. He has authored articles for the AA Files, Urban Omnibus, Current Affairs, theprepared.org, and edited the newsletter Pulp. He has worked for Laus Engineering and Design and Oliver Cope Architect in New York, as well as Hans Koloff and Zahner in in Berlin and Zahner in Kansas City. He holds an M.Arch from Yale School of Architecture, where he also taught architectural history and edited and co-founded Paprika, the student often weekly. Together, A.L. and Nicholas co-authored Withdrawn Waters, a piece in Urban Omnibus on the private pools of New York. And with that, I would give it over to the two of them to give us their presentation, and I very much look forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was an extraordinary panel to follow. So from 1900 to 1972, New York built dozens of public pools. Since 1972, the city has completed just 5. What happened? This work comes out of 2 articles AL and I wrote with Carolina Czech over the summer about private pools in New York for issue 21 of New York Review of Architecture, as well as for Urban Omnibus. One of the city's last new outdoor public pools, the Floating Pool Lady, was completed, or rather docked, at Brooklyn Bridge Park in 2007. Built on a barge in 2008, the pool moved up to Barretto Point Park in the Bronx, where it remains to this day. We talked to Jonathan Kirchenfeld, the Floating Pool Lady's architect, and to quote him, "The pool was only part of what we were creating. What we were really creating was a public space. If you look at the actual pool, it only takes up 1/3 of the barge. I think that was an indication of our priorities, to create a gathering place, a mixer."
That commitment to pools as a place for civic mixing used to be held by communities across the country. As Heather McGee describes in her book, The Sum of Us, in the early 20th century, public pools were the in thing. Towns saw pools not merely as an excellent way for people to cool down, but as focal points for civic pride and even foundries for civil society. McGee quotes a county recreation director in Pennsylvania who said, "Let's build bigger, better, and finer pools. That's real democracy. Take away the sham and hypocrisy of clothes, don a swimsuit, and we are all the same." One of those pools was the Fairgrounds Pool in St. Louis, also mentioned by Marta Guttmann in her talk. When it opened, it was the largest in the country. McGee argues that this enthusiasm came to an end when the term public was expanded to include everyone. Across the country, whether by law or by custom, public pools had been racially segregated. As McGee explains, children excluded from public facilities were forced to escape the summer heat by swimming in dangerous rivers. While the public pools were only officially desegregated by Title III of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, repeated drownings had already propelled a series of legal cases throughout the 1950s, which led certain communities to desegregate facilities. Yet many of these communities almost immediately began to close or sell their public pools rather than follow through on integration. In this photo, 4 young Black men, along with 2 white companions, swam in Pullen Park Pool in Raleigh, North Carolina, as other white swimmers look on poolside, and it's August 1962. This innocuous encounter proved so controversial with the white population of Raleigh as to lead to the temporary closure of all public pools in the city.
At the Fairground Park Pool in St. Louis, violent rioting accompanied the first day of desegregated swimming on June 21st, 1949, also as Marta had discussed in her presentation. Plummeting attendance led to its closure 6 years later. This scorched earth approach won legal approval when, in the 1971 civil rights case Palmer versus Thompson, the Supreme Court ruled that the closure of pools in Jackson, Mississippi had harmed everyone equally and was therefore not racist and therefore okay. Justice Hugo Black wrote, quote, "There was no evidence of state action affecting Negroes differently from white." As communities closed their public pools, there was a rush to build new private pools in backyards and clubs across the nation. According to a 1956 New York Times article, in 1952, there were just 15,000 backyard pools in all of America. In the article, it says in 1955 alone, there were 20,000 new pools built. By 1956, that yearly production was up to 30,000. By 2021, according to the Pools and Spas Association of America, there were 10.4 million residential swimming pools in the country, a 69,233% increase from 1952. They also said there are 309,000 public pools, but that number may be in fact high. While we are unsure of the Association of Pool and Spa Professionals methodology, at least one drowning study we looked at categorized privately owned hotel, club, and apartment building pools as quote unquote public pools. So McGee's thesis about the boom in private pools holds up nationwide, but how does it hold up in New York? If the same trend held true for New York City, the city would have ceased building public pools in the 1960s, and there would have been a boom in private pool construction. At first, as the other presenters have discussed, during the administration of Mayor John Lindsay, from 1966 to 1973, the city bucked the trend toward racially motivated public pool closures. Not only did the Lindsay administration keep existing pools open, it actually built a fleet of dozens of vest pocket and mini pools deployed across the 5 boroughs.
A note about methodology. We built a spreadsheet. By their nature, private pools are private, their ownership fragmented and access guarded. There's no single authoritative list of every private pool in New York. At the same time, private pools are trumpeted amenities, often brandished by their owners and realtors in a constant campaign to sell and rent property. Many of them are therefore often much better photographed, advertised, and even known for their public counterparts. Images of private pools anchor rental listings, feed glossies, and adorn billboards. Using real estate and hotel listings, primarily from Street Easy and Kayak, as well as the occasional phone call with a cagey property manager, we assembled a list, admittedly approximate, of nearly every residential tower and hotel with a pool, cross-indexed by construction date, or for converted projects like the Woolworth Building renovation date. And for the public pools, we listed them from the New York City Parks Department website, noting what year they were built, what borough they're in, and the size of the pool. And this is the graph that we built off of that data set. I think you've already seen it. It's been popping up, showing the number of residential towers with pools built each year since 1918. While a few clubs and hotels, including the Hotel St. George in Brooklyn, the New York Athletic Club, and the Downtown Athletic Club, all built spectacular pools contemporaneously with New York's push in the 1930s to build public swimming facilities funded by the Works Progress Administration. The private sector only built about a dozen residential buildings with pools during the same decade. As you can see, this changed in the 1960s. From 1960 to 1972, various developers built 63 towers with pools. Unlike Mayor Lindsay's efforts, this boom in pool building would be sustained and even accelerate. Indeed, from 1973 to 2021, developers completed another 396 buildings with private pools. And that graphic kind of turned into this other graphic we made for the print edition of issue 21 of New York Review of Architecture. Above, we arranged plans of almost every New York City public pool drawn by Carolina. We definitely saw those earlier, at their true orientation and relative scale to one another, organized chronologically from 1866 to 2008. And down below, we represented private pools that are part of multi-unit residential buildings, also organized chronologically from 1931 to 2021. Each address is a building with a pool connected to the year that it was completed. So you could clearly see private pool building increase over time, while public pool building decreased. And these details from the graphic underline how the trickle of buildings with pools at the beginning of the 1900s grew by the 2000s to a flood.
But that still leaves open the question, was the boom in residential pool construction racially motivated? Possibly not. People used to go to public baths for their everyday hygiene needs, but then plumbing happened and now most of us use private showers. We used to go to public theaters, and now we are prone to stream Netflix on our laptops. Pools could be viewed as just one more front in the conquest of the public by the domestic. That said, when we looked up 1960s era advertisements for some of the first buildings with pools in the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library's archive of real estate brochures, race did appear to play a role. This here displayed is the brochure for one of the very first private rooftop pools, the 1960 building Gracie Towers on 180 East End Avenue, designed by Sylvie Bien and Philip Birnbaum. Birnbaum was actually a prolific New York architect who actually claimed rooftop pools as his own innovation. This pool certainly, in its advertising brochure, trumpets itself as having the very first rooftop pool in New York. And we've not found any earlier rooftop pool to discount that. Here is a plan of the 20 by 40 foot aluminum pool placed squarely at the top of the tower. There's no whites only sign, yet the document prominently features an idyllic rendering of a pool filled entirely with white people. In fact, in every advertising brochure we could find from this period, all emphasize the privacy of these pools, generally indoors on a roof or behind a fence, and feature swimmers who are predominantly, if not entirely white, though the rendering technique sometimes creates ambiguity. In contrast with today's real estate advertisements, which often feature pools entirely without people, advertisements from the 1960s seem to show pools as the central node of bustling whites-only communities. And now we just have 8 examples here. Of the brochures that we found. This is actually the only one with photographs of the examples we found. Still all white people in the photographs.
This contrasts with public pools. As Marta Guttmann discussed, some of them were separate but equal because of the neighborhoods in which they were placed, but many were racially integrated and therefore worked as social mixers. So we demonstrated a boom in the construction of buildings with pools, but what about backyard pools? As was said in that 1956 New York Times article, there were fewer than 15,000 private family pools in the entire country. Chances are very few predate the 1950s. Our data set, assembled primarily from ArcGIS, shows that today there are 14,420 surface pools in New York City. There are over 9,000 in Staten Island. According to the file, there were 10 in Manhattan, over 4,000 in Brooklyn, and over 200 in the Bronx. And while we do not have the dates for each pool, these pools are clustered in neighborhoods that were predominantly white and predominantly built after the 1950s, such as Mill Basin in Brooklyn, largely developed from the 1950s through the 1970s, and Tottenville in Staten Island, which saw significant growth starting in the 1990s. As of the 2010 census, Tottenville was 84% white, and Mill Basin was 74% white.
The thesis of McGee's book is that structural racism is often bad for just about everyone, especially when it leads to defunding public goods. It's even bad for the people with the backyard pools. To go back to our conversation with Jonathan Kirschenfeld, he was saying the big disadvantage of private pools is they are small and you only meet people you know. Through our research, we've identified a few more reasons. First, they're expensive to build and maintain, so you have less equity through access. Second, they are relatively unsafe because they are not as good as community-based safety. And finally, they are expensive to maintain. First, to talk about them being expensive to build, there are two dominant materials used in pool construction: concrete applied via shotcrete or gunite, and steel. Shotcrete is the overwhelming, concrete and steel. Shotcrete is the overwhelming favored material for backyard and in-ground pools, but it comes with some disadvantages for elevated construction. Whereas shotcrete is applied on site, leaving the success of a project to the mercy of the contractor holding the hose, steel is built in sections elsewhere and then welded together on site, allowing for better quality control. Whereas with shotcrete, one needs to chip away at the excess concrete to access pipes or fittings. Steel allows for constant and easy access and is much lighter. Joel Trace, a local architect who specialized in pools and worked on hundreds of pool projects across a 40-year career, actually including the floating pool lady, believes that most of the city's elevated private swimming facilities are made of steel. According to Thomas Schrantz of Aqua Design International, aquatic consultants for public and private projects, any pool not in ground will be more expensive. He estimates a 30% markup, and steel will be even more costly, totaling about $500 to $600 a square foot. For this reason, most pools and towers are in fact quite small, and therefore marketers generally avoid sharing information about their size. Even when they do, only the length dimension is typically shared, as the width of such pools is often quite narrow.
Another major disadvantage is safety, especially for children. According to the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, every year more than 275 children under the age of 5 drown in swimming pools. Nearly 400 children younger than 15 years old drown, and more than 4,100 children seek medical treatment for pool-related accidents, mostly in backyard pools. Another harrowing statistic is that between 2013 and 2015, an estimated 5,600 children under 15 years old were treated each year in hospital emergency rooms for non-fatal drownings in pools or spas. Another study by the Consumer Product Safety Commission shows that the percentage of drowning deaths in children younger than 15 by incident location were at home. And the reason why is that there are no lifeguards, and it really falls on the family to provide safety measures.
Lest we limit ourselves to just relying on studies and statistics, we decided we would go to one of the neighborhoods where almost everyone owns a pool, Mill Basin, and survey some pool owners. What we found from those we talked to us aligned with our research. Pools are a lot of work, very scary with the kids, and a pain to maintain, even while some of them were cherished places where they had learned to swim and have family gatherings.
Here's some more of the survey responses. We asked, how old is your pool? And it really ranged from 2 years old, like we just built it, to 14 years old, built 1 to 2 years before we moved here. We also asked, why did you buy it, or why did you build it? For some people, it was that the pool came with the house. For others, it was practical, not leisure, to teach kids how to swim. Again, the kids use it and it came with the house. Used it when the kids were young after school. We also asked, how much does it cost to maintain? And most people answered that they didn't know. They hire someone else to do the maintenance, or like their spouse takes care of that and they're like, I don't want to think about it. And there was one family who was like, the electricity is expensive. It's $2,000 a year for pumps and filters. $200 a year for chemicals. And that also, money also came into the question when we asked, when do you open and close it? Because it costs money to open it in May to reopen the pool. And at the end of September to close it, it costs around $400. And it was really clear that there were safety measures being taken, especially for pools where kids had access to it, and people put guardrails around the pool, some with alarms if opened, and the kids always use floaties. And some final comments, because we also asked about, like, do you use your pool for social events? Like, how often do you use the pool? And a lot of people said that it's really just for family who come many times a month, or for gatherings with families and friends, or no parties at all. It's just for the kids. Let's see, from a size standpoint, private backyard pools are dwarfed by public pools. This is an overlay of Jackie Robinson Pool, Red Hook Pool, and Flushing Meadows Pool at the same scale as the Google Maps screenshot. No wonder that backyard pools are not automatically social mixers, not only because they're private. The small amount of space almost makes doubling down on family-based events or kids-only events make sense. The size of public pools doesn't seem to correlate to demographics in any way, but it's notable that Harlem, Red Hook, and Flushing, where these pools are located, are not as homogeneously white as Mill Basin. There may be a correlation between pool size and density, but we haven't looked into that yet. Concentration of generational wealth in Mill Basin and the larger lots in Mill Basin means more backyard pools.
That said, pools and what is in the private versus public realm can be a cultural thing. It can become the expectation in certain neighborhoods, and this is what we saw in Mill Basin, that everyone should have a pool, an expectation that is not necessarily tied to demographics or wealth levels, as Ail was just saying. Take, for instance, this new private pool in a double townhouse renovation on the Upper West Side, which is being fought tooth and nail by its neighbors. It is being built in a wealthy neighborhood, probably in fact much wealthier than Mill Basin, but the fabric of the neighborhood itself, the urban planning and architecture that is, discourages the construction of private pools. In fact, I was walking by this the other day and somebody just spontaneously remarked, like, why would you build a pool when there's like a YMCA pool within walking distance of your townhouse? By the way, there is a public pool in Mill Basin, also within walking distance of all those houses. This is just a fun zoom in shot showing you the back of that double townhouse, which, as you can see, they've only preserved the facade and they're digging this ditch in order to build a pool back there. So as you can see, in the Upper West Side, extremely hard to build your own pool. And that's something that architects did and urban planners did. While New York allowed a few to fall in disrepair and close, to its credit, as I think some of the other speakers have underlined too, the city never shut down its public pools out of spite or prejudice, Mccarran Park Pool being the temporary exception. And the government itself has actually stepped up its investments in public pools in recent years. The city spent $50 million to reopen Mccarran Park Pool, renovated by Rogers Marble Architects. The city has just begun the $150 million renovation of the former rebuild of the former Alaska rink and pool in Central Park. And under Mayor de Blasio, the Cool Pools program has updated 16 pools since 2018. Finally, oh, back to Ale.
And this is the newest public pool. It's indoors, the Flushing Meadows Corona Park Pool in Queens, a $66.3 million indoor pool initiated under the Bloomberg administration as part of New York's bid for the Olympic Games, and it was finished in 2008. And just this May, the city granted a site to a second floating pool, the Plus Pool, designed by Dong Ping Wang and Owana Sten Su. I'm really sorry if I said that wrong. And we'll be hearing from them next.
Yet, since the Plus Pool was first proposed in 2010, developers have completed another 196 towers with private swimming facilities. And finally, to close out here, we thought we would go ahead and just show you renderings of the private pools from the last year. So this is just the crop from 2021. As you can see, they never have people in any of these renderings, like the one from the 60s. And they were all, you know, pretty glamorous looking. This last one here is Renzo Piano's 565 Broome Street, which actually has 6 private pools, which is why it's important to say towers with pools rather than conflate that with a number of pools. I think 5 of them are for private residences and 1 of them is for the tower as an amenity. And we thought we would include a plan there so you could see what the penthouse pool looks like. So anyway, this leaves us with 3 conclusions. Conclusion 1, make public pools sexy. That's how the private pools treat them, and why not public pools? Question 2, question assumptions. Why are there no public pools on rooftops? I'm honestly not sure. This actually goes back to, in my mind, Rem Koolhaas in Delirious New York, who pointed out the extraordinary possibilities of extruded land and the elevator using the example of the downtown athletic club. You can have oysters on one floor, boxing on another, and a pool on still another. Why do we only allow the private realm to realize those possibilities? Why have we never proposed a public pool above the first floor? No, really, how come? This is a question I put especially to the students who are in the bathhouse studio. It would make us very happy if one of you would propose a public pool that is on top of a tower that, you know, does all kinds of other things at the same time.
And the third conclusion is equity, to think about the curb cut effect. Framing the construction of public pools as having the curb cut effect, and an investment in one group can cascade out and up and be a substantial investment in the broader well-being of a neighborhood, city, state, nation, one whose policies and practices create an equitable economy, a healthy community of opportunity, and just society. When we design for disabilities and accessibility, we make things better for everyone. As McKee pointed out, towns all over the country drained their pools and took away a public good for everyone. No one had access to a public pool anymore, and only those who had the space and the means to build a pool in their backyard could have access. Private pools are an interesting phenomena, but public pools are better for everyone.
That's a wrap.
No, thank you guys. That was excellent and extremely provocative set of research that demonstrates that the problem is manifold. The problem is manifold in individuals, in developers, in architects, and we need to kind of understand and unpack that. I want to introduce our last presenter, who's certainly not least, and whose work has been shown sporadically throughout the day. We are extremely fortunate to be joined by Oana Sănescu, who is a Romanian architect and runs her own eponymous design studio from New York. With a wide-ranging and interdisciplinary practice, Oana's work is reflecting her pursuit of freedom. She is interested in spatial translation of ideas and environments as reflections of culture at large. Most recently, Oana was nominated for the 2019 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program. Her projects include the Plus Pool, a floating water filtering swimming pool, of which we have heard about today and we'll hear more about in a few moments, and that arguably has catalyzed the public imagination surrounding pools. Oana's other projects include a wide range of collaborations with Nike, MoMA, Virgil Abloh, the Office of Play Lab, 2x4, Arup, the New Museum, the Storefront for Architecture, Need Supply, Fool's Gold, Kanye West, and many more. Current projects include the reconversion of a 500-meter long funicular into a public park in Romania, a nonprofit hotel on the island of Bali in Indonesia, and a vacation home in Canada. Prior to starting her eponymous office, she was a founder of the celebrated office Family and worked for the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, Herzog and de Meuron, Architecture for Humanity, Rex, and Sana. Moana currently teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and has previously instructed design studios at the Architectural Association, the Cooper Union, and Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture and Planning. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ana Stănescu.
Hi, thank you, Jonathan. And thank you everyone, both for the shout outs, but also for the very insightful lectures. I mean, I learned a lot and I also really appreciate, just the incredible amount of resources that you also generously shared, which also will allow me to just focus on the fun side of design and swimming. But I think these are really important conversations and really rich, and I like the idea of spending so many hours really just talking about this. I wish we all would be in a pool. I think that would make it maybe next time. Okay, let me figure this out, just 1 second. All right. Okay, you can see the screen, right?
Very much.
So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'll just adjust it slightly. Like Jonathan said, my name is Ana Stănescu, Romanian architect and designer, splitting time between New York and Berlin. But today I'm here on behalf of Friends of Plus Pool. Plus Pool is this proposal. This was the very first image we conceived. It was mentioned a decade ago. I think after 10 years or after we crossed the decade, we kind of just stopped counting the years. So I think it will stay a decade for a while. But this was probably 2010. So it was a proposal for a water filtering floating swimming pool in the East River. In a section, basically what would happen within the walls of the pool, it would just filter the river water so that one could swim safely in the rivers of New York. There are absolutely no whales in the East River, as we it's a theme, a recurring theme. But where did this idea come from, or how did this come about? So we already talked a lot about today. I think it's easy when you live in New York to forget that Manhattan is an island, but also that New York has an incredible waterfront, incredible, not just Manhattan itself, but all boroughs, that the city is really surrounded by water. And as it was mentioned too, the waterfront used to be a very rich social scene. And it wasn't just for health benefits, but really just socially a very important place. We also unfortunately know that today all the excitement around the waterfront and the development leads all the way to the water, but it's do not touch the water, right? So all the, let's say, parks, all the recent developments, unfortunately did not really include the water itself. And the reason for that is the reason why these bathing facilities have died in the last 100 years, and why we're not allowed to get close to the water today are really all these little tiny red dots, which are the so-called CSO, combined sewage overflow. The title says it all. And this is a map that shows, it's slightly outdated, but I doubt there's a dramatic change, which shows really the water quality around New York. The kind of brown-orange color is an unfortunate choice. But basically our idea was really rather simple. Everyone knows it's incredibly hot in summer in New York. I think quite often we treat the waterways almost like gaps, like vacuums between boroughs, but can we look at them differently? Can we look at it as wealth? Why wouldn't we be able to actually just swim in the water? So it also really started in this really rather banal way of we should be able to just go for a swim, and that really just visceral desire to just cool off in the summer. And the idea of it being a plus, I mean, on the one hand, it's just being silly, to be fair. But what we thought was a great opportunity to do a couple of things. So first of all, the Plus Pool is an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and I really appreciate seeing the incredible numbers of private pools. It's really mind-blowing. I think if we start looking now at Olympic-sized, I'm going to say there's only like 10 maybe or something like that, or maybe, I don't think there's even 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools in New York. So we started there with the idea of it being Olympic sized, and in essence, just kind of cut it in two and then flip it onto itself. That allowed us to try to make as many New Yorkers happy as possible by essentially having 4 pools. We have a kids pool, we have a lounge pool, a lab pool, and a sports pool that can be combined in different ways. So essentially you could have an Olympic sized swim pool and then still maintain the kids and the lounge pool as separate. Of course, the design itself is also reminiscent just of the New York City grid that we're so familiar with. So it becomes, in a way, it tries to extend the city and the grid and the logic of the city onto the waterway. And how did this all happen? So it was mentioned the Plus Pool is basically the brainchild of Dongping Wong and myself. So Family New York, we're both co-founders of Family New York. And we partner up together with the Play Labs, the Office of Play Lab, Archie Lee Coates and Jeffrey Franklin. And initially, Dong and myself, we're architects, we're designers, we know how to imagine things. And we needed help from the Play Labs to also we needed help to learn to communicate these things. So what we did is, we had the renderings that I showed you, and we basically did a website, a booklet, and a poster, a series of posters. And because it's also a lot of students here, I will talk a little bit about the design, of course, too, but also the process behind it, because I think it's a key part of kind of what happened and what brought us here today. So what we did is we literally made a website, booklets, posters, and just sent them around. We sent them to universities, we sent them to engineering offices, we sent them to probably a bunch of random people, kind of just throwing it out there to see what happens. This was 2010, a couple of years after the financial crash, which I think my generation and my age peers were definitely marked by that moment in time. Arup, one of the largest engineering company in the world, reached out a couple of weeks later. I'm pretty sure we hung up on them because we thought it was a prank, but somehow I think partially because there's a lot of New York-centric media, because New Yorkers like to talk about themselves, it kind of blew up rather quickly. Very unexpected for us, but it started kind of having a life of its own. I think it's rare that this happens really in architecture in quite such an extent. And what we learned, I'm saying that mostly because I think we learned a lot of unexpected lessons here that people just viscerally reacted to it. And I think it was the idea of really just wanting to be in the water and to swim. So I think in many ways it was very tangible. It was a no-brainer for people. So it really allowed them to sort of, for this desire for it to really just unfold rather naturally, which is really amazing to see. And at that point, it felt like, okay, there's so much interest and support. I think we have to do something with that. We have to really try to use it in a productive way, or at least try to, push the project to see what can happen. We're all just a few years out of school. So what we decided to do, we did 2 Kickstarter campaigns. The first one in 2011, we raised $40,000. And 2 years later, we raised over $250,000, which is again incredible for just 4 designers, a few years out of school, trying to really aim for the seemingly impossible. What's really interesting in this is, and altogether for us as architect and designer, was we very little we didn't really have to communicate a project in the typical sort of architectural circles as one would normally do with a project, but really the main communication always happened with community boards, with politicians, with swimmers, with all sorts of different people. So I'm saying that because it's a really important, I think, exercise to learn how to communicate to actually the users of the project. So it's very insightful and really a different way of thinking of architecture that maybe we do sometimes in school, or how we kind of tend to be trained to. So what that meant, for example, is trying to find ways in order to get people involved furthermore in the pool, but also to give them autonomy over the pool, to give them, to kind of try to nurture almost this desire for the project. So and give them ownership over it. So we came up with this idea of the tiles, which is very similar to the idea or to what happens with the benches in Central Park, for example, where I'm sure you've all seen them. There's very many. One can not buy a bench, support a bench, donate, support the Central Park organization, and really just write a nice note on a bench. So similarly, in our case, the idea was, can you actually, we made these tiles that one can buy and can still to this day buy, basically donate to the pool and therefore buy one of these tiles, which gives, on which one can write whatever they want in such a way. And by that, you're kind of enabling, supporting the organization, allowing this project to be built. And with the goal that on day one, when it's open, you can go and find your own contribution. It's almost like, adding a brick to a wall or to a house and going and seeing your own brick. It's almost like you put it there and you enabled it, because truly this project would be nothing without the incredible support that we received from people. Alongside with the tiles, one also gets these first dips tickets. So when the pool opens, the people that contributed to it in this direct manner then also feel involved. It was very heartwarming too to kind of see what people did with that, what they, many bought tiles for their children. I think there was a proposal happened with it, and it's really rather incredible. And that's something that I keep coming back to, because as we've seen today, it is one of those things. A pool is one of those things that touches very many people from very many different perspectives. It doesn't have a singular audience, but it really spans across age groups and across needs, desires, so on and so forth. What did we do with all the money? So we said it would filter the water, so we had to figure out how to filter the river water. We are lucky through all the people that through the outreach we partnered with the Lemon Doherty Observatory, Columbia University, and with Arab and a few other people, and we started really trying to test and kind of see what happens. This was the first filtration test that we did down at the Brooklyn Bridge Park. It's Archie, I believe, or maybe Wes, hard to tell from this angle. But basically, each vertical element that you see here is a different filter. So we were basically pumping water from the river and kind of pushing it through. There's a very light discoloration that you probably wouldn't notice, but that got us very excited at the time. We had to, none of us knew anything about water, by the way, before, or not in that sense. We knew how to surf or swim or enjoy it, but not in a, from a research perspective. So we had to kind of learn all these things. We tested for the water for these 15 elements. Number 2 and 3 are the most challenging ones. Had our little observatory with rented tools and everything. And then with the second Kickstarter, the major milestone was really doing the same testing, but in river. So we built the so-called Float Lab, which had 3 tubs. That's our water engineer, Greg, who's awesome. That was his office for an entire summer, not a bad place to be in. And we had these 3 tubs where we would simultaneously test different filter configurations, explaining us the science. And basically what happened, this graph always looks a little bit too good to be true. This is the kind of real, not fancified version of it. So I can just stick to that. But in essence, let me just start here. So what you see in gray is the quality of the water in the river. In blue, is the water that we filtered, so the quality of the water within the filtered tubs that we did. And the red line here is the level of pool pool code, pool standards that we were trying to achieve. And as you can tell, we had a really rough start, so to speak, 13 weeks, if you want to consider that a start. By which time we were actually really able to realize what the right filtration was, and that from then on we were able to really filter things substantially better. And this is the detail from week 13 on. In blue is the quality of the water in the tub, and then the rest above. I mentioned before that we also weren't communicating, that it took a different sort of learning curve to learn how to communicate this to different audiences. Similarly, it was a whole learning curve to learn how to test it, to learn to speak this kind of world of the water and the whole language and everything around that. A couple of things happened in meanwhile. I think this is our badge of honor in terms of this is when our parents kind of stopped questioning whether we're just kind of messing around. But a few other things that happened, we realized early on that, you know, this issue of polluted waterways is very, it's a common theme across the world. The Sydney mayor at one point tweeted at us, and Arab Sydney was really serious about trying to get it off the ground there, which was tempting. None of us had been to Sydney, but we wanted to, you know, we said we're New Yorkers, so if we do it in New York, we can figure it out anywhere else. So we stuck to it. And one other major milestone, and this is Kara Meyer, she's our deputy director. So the piece of paper that she holds there is really important, and basically it's proof of Friends of Pluspool becoming 501c3. So a few years after, I think this is 5 years after putting out those renderings, we realized that actually after meeting with several developers, which I'm sure built many of those towers and pools that you're describing, we realized that the only way maybe in the American sort of climate, for the only way to guarantee that the pool would be built to our vision and to kind of the standards that we had when it came to, and not become just a luxury amenity, was for us to form a nonprofit, which is dedicated to the fundraising, building, and operation of the Plus Pool. So the piece of paper that she's holding there is what enabled us. And what happens with that, again, new learning curve, is you need to learn how to fundraise and throw galas and so on and so forth, which is fun in itself. And this was actually our very first gala. It was at the Carousel in Brooklyn Beach Park. And this is Connor Dwyer. So he has a gold Olympic medalist. He has his medal always with him, apparently. It's really heavy, I have to say, but it was definitely the attraction of the gala. But what was really incredible about this gala was, of course, not only that you have someone like that sort of come and support the project, but it was one of those moments where we had, you know, we just had fellow friends, we had artists, we had architects, we had musicians, we had swimmers, we had community leader, activists. We had just such broad strokes of people all in the same room, really, because everyone was just interested in more or less just swimming and getting this in the water. And I think it's moments like that where you kind of feel how architecture or how a design can really impact really very many different communities, and that was a really exciting moment. This was the last gala that we had. It was at Seagram. That's Joshua David enjoying himself there. He's the founder of the Highline and a huge supporter of us. Needless to say, Friends of Pluspool is following the model of the Friends of Highline. In terms of inception, he played a huge role in supporting us. But not only that, these galas or the fundraisers are also opportunities to sort of engage with different artists and to put different things out. This is a pool float done by Sydney Sherman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, but you should look it up. She's a lot of fun. So she did this rather slightly creepy looking, if I may say so, float that one can buy anywhere from the MoMA to so on and so forth, really in really exciting ways. And I always say that this is one of the slides that actually that I find most touching, and you can't read it in a way. That's the point. All these names that you see, basically it's a list full of names of people who donated to the Kickstarter campaigns. And you know, it's, for anyone involved in nonprofits, you know that it's hard, and it's oftentimes a thankless work. But whenever the going gets tough, we look back at this and we look back at, you know, the people who are really just supporting the project and really just believe in it, and this is really what kind of keeps us pushing forward. Another thing that we did, it was important to us, as I mentioned, that we didn't want it to become a luxury amenity. And what that meant is we wanted to make it as free, as accessible as possible, but also to a broad strokes of New Yorkers. So really kind of allow everyone to be part of it. But that means everyone also doesn't mean just opening the door, that one needs to make an effort towards that, right? So one thing that was important to us was, I think it was mentioned at one point in the comments, the lack of swimming abilities, how few New Yorkers actually, how many New Yorkers do not have actually swimming abilities, which is really unfortunate considering how the city is surrounded by water. So what we did is we partnered with NYCHA, the New York Housing Authority, and started a swim program this summer. Last summer it was interrupted, of course. This summer it's back on. Several hundred kids were able to learn to swim through that, and it's been really also exciting to be able to get the program started. This happens in several pools across the different boroughs, and really the hope is that by the time the pool is built, we are ready, we know what an educational swimming program entails, and we're ready to really just kind of make it happen. You know, to sustain the communities and everyone's interest in the project over 10 years is not easy, to say the least. So we keep trying to find ways to both communicate the importance of this to, of course, the city, the authorities, but then also to the public at wide, and really make sure our community is growing. So 2019, I think, shortly before the end of the world, we did this light installation by South Street Seaport, where the silhouette that you see here marked by the lights, it's a little bit smaller than what the size of the pool would be, but basically it was a light installation that would change in real time based on the lights reflecting essentially the river water quality. So basically, if it was blue, you could swim. If it was pink, it wasn't recommended to swim. And this really just wanted, you know, is very visible, of course, from the bridge, but also we wanted to draw this alarm again, which in essence the pool wants to do too. The pool isn't so much about itself, but really it's about drawing attention to this huge wealth that we have in New York, and to this huge area that should be part of our lives, and not just, you know, a gap between boroughs or something that we should be afraid of or stay away from. And this was just this kind of casual reminder that whenever you'd pass it and you'd see it's blue, you're like, well, the water quality is good enough. One should be able to swim now. Why can't we? So it's this kind of question, this constant sort of raising the questions again and again. So in 2019, around the same period, the city put out an RFEI, expression of interest, which I think you can all also read online, for a floating swimming facility in the East River. And it was quite amazing, because when you respond, you have to say, thank you for allowing us to imagine a floating swimming facility in the East River. But this was a huge breakthrough already to just show that the city was interested in a way to pursue this conversation even further. And you know, the reason it takes so long for this project to move forward, while I think it was like 300 pools were built meanwhile, or at least proposed. I think it was 196 built and 10, can't remember, but anyway, is really, maybe this slide shows it best. And this is, we don't really oftentimes show us, and this slide is the kind of brainchild of way too many people in a huge conference room, and you have environmental lawyers, and you have people who work for the city, and you have lobbyists, and you have architects and engineers and scientists, and everyone just trying to figure out, okay, but how does one permit this? The challenge with doing something that hasn't been done before is that there's no clear way of how to do it. So the pool itself, for example, it's not a building, and it's not a barge. So then what is it, and who gives their blessing for it to happen? And this is kind of a pick your own adventure type of, okay, we can try A, B, C, D, and then like it's and you know, it hasn't been fully tested and so on and so forth. But really, this is the main challenge here, because in order to do something that hasn't been done before, you really need to find ways to do it, and you need someone to get behind to enable you to do it. And that's why I really appreciate about the many conversations tonight, because you talked a lot all about policy, and I think a lot has to do with our ability to now come back to policy and really also allow the policies to move with their time, and really enable us to respond to you know, new conditions that we live in. In spring of this year, it was finally announced that based on the RFEI, the city gave us a site. So for the whole first time, we have a home, and we were close to a community, and we were able to truly to a more, literal physical community, and we're able to kind of build and invest in a place. So far, the pool, basically, I can tell you, we had huge site selection processes where we looked all over the city. There's very few places where you can do it because of the strength of the currents and the water depth. We met with incredible numbers of community boards. I was always incredibly heartened by the desire and the openness that people had towards the project. But this is our first home. And what we would really hope with the project is really that it doesn't just become about itself, but it's something that whether it replicates itself or just has different iterations in whatever shape or form throughout the city, the idea is to make just swimming and the river accessible to people. And one way in which we always articulated and that I want to touch on also that I think is important for the students is in a traditional process, right? Things start with a policy in place, and a client gets their funding together, picks a site, chooses a team that then does a design, and it may or may not reach the public depending on the project itself. What we inadvertently did, and I do want to point out that I'm not sure how much we were aware of any of this, but we were also just kind of young and silly and doing things. We kind of flipped the whole process and kind of started with a design that then I was able to unlock a team, which now led to the site, and which we're hoping ultimately that it brings us back to policy. But I keep thinking about this too, and how can we both make sure we're not just, we're not letting the work just be a result of the systems, but with the work that we do, we're also challenging systems in place, but also that they come back into the policy, and that there is more, can it be more of an ecosystem between public design, the teams, the funding, the policies in place, and so on and so forth, that they're not opposite ends or removed categories, but really something that sort of coexist. And really, all this effort is for, I think in the past lectures, it was made clear the significance that a swimming pool can have. I really appreciate also the study with the private pools, because the idea of a private pool, of course, especially if you think of California and things like that, it's such a symbol of wealth and luxury. But in truth, in a public level, it's really a form of just public space. And it's one of the few public spaces that one can be almost just themselves, as naked or as similar as we can be to one another. And I think the role, just from a health societal perspective, to be able to have these places where we can swim in the same waters and really just be, and however we think of swimming, whether it's exercising or lounging or just meeting a friend, I think it's crucial from so many perspectives. So that's it from me, and I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all the previous lecturers. This is really, really informative.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. And I really appreciated how you brought it full circle to the question of where and how do designers take agency and really tackle the systems that have really been driving the conversation. I'm definitely here today to facilitate other questions in the audience. So please, as you have them, let me know or kind of write them into chat, and I'm happy to ask them. I have a few kind of thoughts and questions that I'd like to kind of open up the conversation with. I think one of the things, and I was writing another one that I'm more fetched by as I was hearing you guys, and I had some previous ones, but I think the thing that strikes me that's quite interesting about both of the presentations is the fact that you both highlight that water is a value system, or there is inherently value placed in the physicality of water. Now, whether that's monetary water in that it increases the value of a property, and we see the problems of that related to gentrification, or the idea that even as we've seen, and I think Juana just mentioned California, of course, we knew in the 70s that what happened due to the kind of rising droughts, new policies were formed on requiring the draining of public pools, which kind of dealt into the countercultural use of them for example, skate parks. But nevertheless, we kind of understand the kind of reuse of water, something that you're engaged in or actively interested in. And the plus pool is actually a way to reckon this with climate value in another way. So I guess my questions are, how should designers and architects, when they're tackling this problem, tackle the questions of value and arguably the capitalist system that these are adopted under? Sorry, it's probably a big question. But
No one's going. Can you just reframe it, Jonathan? Are you just referring to the how one faces this notion of values or value?
I think what I'm asking is how should we help designers think about value in the process of engaging in water into the future, when it is engaged with climate discussions and it is also engaged with gentrification discussions?
I think it's a tough question in many ways. I mean, the way I tend to approach things, and I know the way it always works for me, really is just, and it might not be a, I think, satisfying or desired answer, but it is really through personal involvement of sorts. Like, I think if it resonates with you, you know what I mean, if you experience it, if you're passionate about something, then it can open itself up to many things. So what I'm trying to say with that, I think with the pool, even though we've been working on it for that many years, I'm still learning about it on a regular basis, and how I'm still learning how it resonates with different communities, with different people, different backgrounds, and genders, and so on and so forth. And it's in a way, it's an excuse for me to engage with the world ultimately. But I find any architecture really is in that sense. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. Probably not.
I have a, oh, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think, Jonathan, I think a portion of your question about like the value of water, and particularly because you mentioned climate change and other things. One of the things I think that kind of needs to be brought into this conversation a bit, and it fills in a bit of the gap in the first presentation about why the construction of public pools largely stopped after the mid-1970s, was that there was this whole mind shift of how the public prefers to engage with water. And since that shift, so basically, if you think about the public pools were built for basically one of two reasons. One was to cool off or cool down, and the other one was to learn to swim. You can take one of those two objectives, which is to cool down, and move it into something called the spray shower or spray feature. And this is where I think it fits into this missing narrative of why the public stopped building public pools, particularly here in New York. In the time that all those private pools were built in buildings and up in the air and things like that, there were over 800 spray showers built, and we still build spray showers almost on every playground. So when you think about the value of water and how folks choose to engage with water, you go to our public scoping sessions for new public amenities, or we're building a new park. Very few people in the public ask for a swimming pool. Everyone asks for spray showers. That's what they want. And also because you don't need to swim, you don't need to know how to swim to get that element of cooling. And you get a much longer season. You get April to the end of October in a spray shower versus a much shorter season for pools. So I don't think that's exactly what you were asking, but it does get to the value of water, how people engage with water, and certainly it gets to climate issues, because we use a lot less water with spray showers than you ever do with swimming pools. So that whole environmental resource conservation around water is met through this idea of spray features, even though admittedly it just meets one of those two criteria. It doesn't teach kids how to swim, I acknowledge that, but it cools an awful lot of people off. So I just wanted to share that, because I think it fills in a missing, perhaps partially explains the pullback on the construction of public pools post mid-1970s.
As the father of a toddler, I've been going to a lot of playgrounds this year, and so I've learned it's amazing how every single one has a spray. Almost every single one I've gone to has a spray feature. And when you leave New York, that's not the case. New York's playgrounds are actually much higher quality than other cities' playgrounds. I had one other thought, Jonathan, on the value of water, which is something that struck me when in school we did a studio project about Bridgeport, and one of the key things in Bridgeport's existence as an industrial hub was actually its ready access to water. Specifically, Connecticut built a series of reservoirs that all feed into Bridgeport to make it so that it's extremely cheap to have gigantic amounts of water, which are very important if you're going to have industrial, like large-scale industry. And I think this is an amazing thing that Carolina did in her project, which is that she, in that diagram, depicts how New York has this series of reservoirs that actually give the city of New York access to extraordinary amounts of water. And the physical presence of this is something that only struck me recently. Essentially, the Catskills exist as a park so that New York City can exist as a city. Like the Catskills are a park not just because we think that's pretty and we like nature, but because New York needs to safeguard its access to fresh water, and that's where the water comes from. And so there are actually these giant areas in like the rural hinterlands that are never going to become cities, or never going to become dense, or never going to have a lot of development in them. And that's so that New York can remain dense, because New York needs their water. And so it's actually this crazy power dynamic. I think there are even some small towns where like they're not allowed to go in the reservoir, and the reservoir is controlled essentially by the city of New York. And so it's like your town is being dictated to by like a bureaucrat in the city of New York's. Anyway, so
I think they would refer to that as colonized.
No, it's this the rural urban. It's something very kind of imperialistic about it, even though it's all within the United States. Anyway, but at the end of the day, it's essentially, I don't know exactly how it works, but free to use the water in New York. So they've gone through all this effort. It's extremely expensive, and then they make it free to everybody, so you can just turn on the tap. Which is of huge communal value.
Al, you wanted to join in on that?
Yeah, just a short comment. I think what's interesting is that we're starting to get almost to talk about supply chains of water, because it's not just like access in terms of leisure, it's access in terms of like drinking water, and like you were saying, for climate change, for cooling. Mark, it's really great to learn about those spray showers. Those do seem like the missing link. But that makes me think of like one way that designers can think about the value of water is to maybe not think of it so much as like private versus public, and like what is a private good, what is a public good, but more of like how like the spray shower thing. It's like we all have private showers in our homes, but it can be made into a public good. So it's like, what do we consider private now that can be turned into something public? How can we kind of increase access in all the different ways? Kind of like Alana's project, it's like, it's not just about the plus pool, it's also about teaching kids how to swim. It's also about filtering the water and cleaning it up. So thinking about all of the different dimensions of water infrastructure, I think, is important.
That's great.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, Al just said something that really struck me. I mean, we're talking about water as a substance, and then the place the water goes. There is no private water. All water is public. Water itself is public. The thing that feeds these pools, so it's the vessel in which it's going is what's private or public. The water itself is public, and that again comes from the prior comment about the Catskills and the Adirondacks and the reservoirs and all that stuff. The material is public. There is no such thing as private water. It's the vessel in which it's going. So it's just we could go down a whole track on that, but so you're taking a public resource and putting it in a private vessel that you're then privatizing that resource and making it available only to certain people in the case of the private pools in the buildings, I'm speaking, as opposed to the public pools or public spray showers.
So I just have to say, I have a lot to say about that subject, about private and public water. Okay. But Addison's hands was first.
Go ahead. I think you're closer to the topic currently at hand.
So first off, I should say, Alana, it's great to see how far Plus Pool has come. I remember looking at this over our kitchen table, right, and talking with you and Don and Archie about this great vision you had, and saying, yes, you should answer that email from Arab. It's important to do that. So it's wonderful, really wonderful to see it. And I so admire your insistence that this remain a public project for reasons that I'm about to explain. So when I was hearing the Nicholas and Ailes presentation on the privatization of pools, and I too am a fan of Heather McGee's work, I was really reminded of the thinking of Silvia Federici, who is a feminist historian of feminism and a feminist historian of feminism and capitalism. And in her writing and in the series of essays that have just been republished in a wonderful collection called Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, she makes a very powerful point about the ways in which the privatization of public resources, of which your presentation is an example of, is part of the long-term operation of capitalism, of the continual primitive accumulation of public resources that are now held privately. And she makes this point again and again and again, or powerfully, about the ways in which we experience a diminishing of social goods that we used to believe we held in common with regard to education, with regard to urban spaces, with regard to land, and with regard to water. And here I just profoundly disagree with you, Mark, that we now think of these as resources which are private that we need to pay for. And so the pools are a perfect example. The private pools that you describe are a perfect example of that process, one that I believe in the 1960s was absolutely fueled by racist practices, but that in fact feeds into and supports a much longer and broader history of the diminution of what Federici would call the common goods that are held in common. What I also tend to think of goods that are held in the public realm. And so, yeah, while water in theory may be public, it may be a commonly held resource. What we find is that water is captured for uses that are not determined democratically. And so the creation of the Croton Aqueduct, which we can all admire, had definite goals, right? Definite goals. The capturing of land in the Catskills to use to feed New York. I think if we were to talk to people in the Catskills, they would have quite a different view of the outcome of that capture of what they view perhaps as their source, for which they aren't compensated. Or even if we remove it from the language of capitalism, for which they have they derive no benefit. And I'm not even going to California and Colorado and Washington and the huge fights over water rights and water use that exist there. So I think we have to be really careful about what we define as public, what we call as public, and situated in the political economy of our times. And I do believe that is a topic for design studios, yes. So.
Thank you, Martha. I think that keyed into a lot of the things I was am interested in with regard to what right and how do designers really question the rights, even as Ale and Nick mentioned, looking at this Upper West Side aspect, and then clearly there is an architect and designer who is complicit in that capture process, that kind of cordoning off of what, in Mark's point, should be a public resource, should be a right to access. But does seem like what we're seeing is that access changes also value systems of a piece of land just in its proximity. The fact that it has an ability to hold water for recreation in a private sector radically upvalues the Renzo piano tower, for example.
Exactly.
So
yeah, and if I just may weigh in, I love the spray showers. I remember being taken to playgrounds as a kid and, you know, being told to go to, we use the spray showers. Remember youth, they're treasured memories of going to playgrounds in Queens with my grandfather and cooling off in those sprays. They're fantastic resources, but they should not be coming, I believe, as the only public resource we give children to play with water. I mean, kids need a plethora of resources, not a few. And I was involved, the Parks Department under Adrian Benepe had this very ambitious, and Mayor Bloomberg had a very ambitious Learn to Swim program that I was happy to join as an advisor. And I have to say, and one of the biggest problems, this was a program that Benepe came up with to teach every second grader in New York to swim. It was a public health measure. And the biggest challenge, there were two challenges we faced. One was to make sure that kids had bathing suits and swimming caps, which they didn't have. And two was to find pools that children could learn to swim in. Plenty of private pools, but there were very few public pools constructed in schools, or available for instruction during the academic year, right, when the big public pools, the WPA and the other pools, are shut down. And so one of the proudest moments of my life as a public servant was when I was able to get or to convince the City University of New York to collaborate with the Department of Public, the Parks Department and the DOE we could use the pool at City College as a place for second graders to learn to swim. And that program, I don't know if that program exists anymore. It's obviously shut down during COVID, but we would bring, get a school bus, get kids from local schools to come to our school, to come in, to use the pool court. The diagram that Awana you showed of the collaboration that it takes to make your pool is sort of similar to what it took to make it possible for children to have a half an hour to swim in a public university's pool. And it just seems criminal that it should be such a challenge. But yeah, it's a public health measure. And so it's wonderful to see that Plus Pool is working with, is grabbing onto education as a big piece of its program.
Jonathan, if I could address that, because Learn to Swim is still a very alive, robust program. I don't know about the particular relationship with City College, but as far as parks facilities, we offer Learn to Swim year-round at our 11 indoor pools, and it's done in many DOE pools, although there's not as many indoor pools at Department of Education facilities as there once were. And then we do it during the summer at all of at the outdoor pools, obviously not the minis, but the intermediate and the Olympics. We do it in the early morning hours between 8 and 11. We have Learn to Swim. In fact, I was going to comment on that early on because I don't recall, Marta, if it was in your presentation, another one where you had that photograph of that iconic WPA era poster from Astoria, which tagged it Learn to Swim. And that was the title of the program in 1937. And that's still the title of the program today. And so it is a very robust program. And we do consider it part of our mission is teaching folks how to swim. And I do also want to acknowledge, I mean, we would love to have more swimming pools. I'm not saying it's something that the Parks Department is opposed to. It's just the fact that, partially the amount of land that's needed, as we've all spoken to here, but it's the cost. Everything comes down to the resources that we're given or the resources that we can raise, and the cost of building a new pool versus, again, the cost of spray showers, which admittedly do not achieve the same purposes, but achieve partially. They have overlapping purposes. They don't achieve entirely the same purpose.
I'll just jump in there real quick. Sorry, we're all going in. Just wanted to respond to Marta and just say quickly that one way in which we're thinking about it, and to me, it's like a kind of a non-issue in that sense that, I mean, in an ideal world, I think the pools would be something like the library too, right? Like each neighborhood which would have its public library, private pool in which you could go. It's not, I think it's still very much seen like a luxury or something that's rather exceptional, but it should be as basic as that. Yeah, like what's a neighborhood unit. And first and foremost, it's a safety issue when it comes to a place like New York. And I can only mention Sandy, but I mean, one doesn't even have to think of Sandy in order to kind of think that way. But in terms of just public health, sanity, it should be, it's a matter of human rights, the way I look at it.
So revealing to see the quantity of illness and death and accident that came from private pools. That was utterly revealing to me. Thank you for that.
I don't believe, though, that our public pools are considered luxuries, as what was just said. I mean, our public pools are, they're essential. I mean, they're used by everyone that comes to use them, and they're used extensively. And yeah, I mean, they're not in every neighborhood, that's admittedly. And it's interesting because I came here from Philadelphia, where Philadelphia has a sixth of the population of New York City. Yet we had 71 outdoor swimming pools in Philadelphia versus 53 here in New York. And there they were embedded in almost every neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia, and had very similar use patterns to what we're talking about here. So.
Mark, apologies. I didn't mean it that way. What I'm trying to say is, I think for people, it's still seen as a luxury. It's not seen as like something normal to go to the pool. I'm a swimmer in Lasker, so I'm all in favor, and I think that public pools are really amazing, or like doing a pretty good job in New York. But I think it's still not built so much into the, let's say, local public culture that, you know, Carolina mentioned Eastern Europe, so I'll just jump on that. You wouldn't graduate, not that you wouldn't graduate, every high school kid would learn how to swim, like no questions asked. And I think that kind of behavior, that's what I meant with the libraries, that kind of attitude just needs to be normalized, because for many families, and I mean, New York has an incredible poverty rate, right? And many communities living below, not to mention around the poverty line, and that access to it, even if there are public pools, it's just there's many obstacles that even bridge the gap between going from someone's apartment to the public pool and all the tools that requires. That's all I meant. I didn't mean to say the public pools are actually.
Addison.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Carolina, I think you're go ahead, because you're following up directly to this.
Sorry, Addison, I hope you get to talk. No, I just want to emphasize what Anna was saying. And I think that kind of back to the earlier panel we had, when maybe I like not so graciously kind of talked about how my perception of the pool from where I grew up in Eastern Europe and New York City, I saw a difference. And it's not that, you know, like New York City parks or New York City or people who are doing something wrong. It's just nowadays, and this kind of in, you know, time and politics and a kind of environment where now there's so much more difficult to kind of, you know, both kind of use, promote, and make accessible public or not public, you know, however you want to define it, resources. And I think it's really, for me, it's actually very uplifting that we have all these discussions, because I think what also is very much needed, the kind of continuous kind of reminder that the pools, the water, the water as a kind of public resource should be seen as such, and the city is providing that service and it's doing a kind of amazing job in kind of upgrading or rebuilding where needed. But perhaps with the kind of pressures, you know, there might be even more, or there may need to be even more that needs to be made. And, you know, ideas like Plus Pool, kind of comparing a kind of private to public, I think it only will help everybody in a city to become basically conscious of the kind of pressing issue of the value of water and equity of access.
Jonathan, if I may, I'd like to address AL's and Nick's comments about, you know, our thoughts about pools up in the air on I think as you were wrapping up your presentation, you spoke about, you know, challenging the students to think about pools on upper stories. I just wanted to acknowledge, when you think about public pools, and again, it goes back a little bit to Marta's earlier comments about the WPA era. We have land. That's one of the things we're very fortunate to have at parks. You know, we have 14% of the city of New York is under our jurisdiction. And also we don't build a lot of multi-story buildings. So the idea of putting a pool up in the air is not really something that's practical from a public pool perspective. It has a lot to do with security and lines and even ADA accessibility. Obviously, there's always elevators. But also a lot, when you think about the private pools, they tend to be, as you saw in those photographs and some of the renderings, very small, and they would never meet the needs of a public pool for meeting capacity for all the interest we have at pools. That is not to say, though, for the students, as you know, from visiting the 3 pools we visited over the last few weeks, all of our pools are on structure, even though they may appear to be on land. They have a whole city of infrastructure underneath them, supporting them with tunnels and pipes and everything. And as we talked about in some of our visits, those pools are actually kind of corks floating in a chamber, if you will. That's a whole other type of infrastructure. So I think of like Marcus Garvey that we talked about earlier, like portion of Marcus Garvey pool is floating on top of, is literally above the locker rooms. So I don't foresee public pools being built on elevated levels or floors high up in the air, 10, 20 stories, whatever, because the nature of how we build buildings in the public sector and to serve the public. But again, that's not to say they're not complicated structures and that they are not already built on structures. Again, very few of our pools actually sit on ground. So thank you. Just wanted to address those thoughts.
So I have a couple of disconnected comments, and I know we're running up on time, but so many things people have said are so fascinating. I think it's important as we're as an architecture school, students are learning to think practically and to think within limits and to deal with constraints, but also to imagine and to consider alternatives and propose things that kind of expand our conceptions. So for example, thinking about how much parks has to work within the limits of what the budget and what the available land are, versus what those budgets and possibilities and cost of labor were in the 1930s. Given that the prompt is the various proposed federal budgets and programs, as just one kind of reminder that all of these limits are political and artificial and can be changed. The federal government currently spends roughly $50 billion a year solely on maintaining our nuclear weapons, weapons which I think we all hope will never be used, and if they were, could only be used to commit genocide and to destroy life on this planet. So in other words, $50 billion a year for nothing of any value at all. If you divided that up by the cost of a Lasker pool reconstruction, I think we could build 300 Lasker pools a year just with that dollar amount. So pick the 300 biggest cities in the country and give them one pool a year. All of a sudden, the dollar amounts enable thinking very, very big, right? We could think about cantilevered pools that hover over the Hudson. Why not? Why not everybody having access to these kind of grand and uplifting and amazing experiences that currently are available to the neighbors of these fabulous pools that were built in the 30s and have been maintained and are still such a fantastic, uplifting, out of the everyday, what a magical place to go kind of experience. Thinking at a much more, even a more pedestrian level, I loved bringing up the spray showers because it made me realize, thinking about the range of typologies that could be diagrammed, looking at Carolina's project, what if we called a sprinkler a micro pool or a hydrant for the urban equivalent? And what if we thought about water parks as the equivalent, almost invariably private? I'm sure there are some state parks on lakes that have water slides and things like that. But the water park with the wave pool and the splash mountain and the 20 different slides and rafts and all of that, currently a private thing. What if we thought of that as the equivalent to the monumental pool complex and asked, can we build those? Can we offer those experiences to kids that are, a whole day running around and splashing and hopefully not catching any E. coli, eating hot dogs, all of that. That if we're imagining somehow, and I think this is a premise to all of the presentations, that running around in the sun and in the water and being silly and recreating and, enjoying the feeling of having a body, that has something of fundamental value, and that can have something to do with forming a public or multiple publics or better publics of love and joy, then we should be trying to expand access to those experiences wherever we can. And I think that's why we all applaud what Mark and Parks do, because that's the work, is getting these experiences to kids and adults all over the city. And it's also why why Plus Pool is exciting, why what AL and Nicholas are doing is exciting, because it's making us focus on the value of these experiences and how they, a world where all of these experiences were experienced by everybody might be a better world. And that's all I have to say.
In some ways, those are extremely great concluding comments, and I think we're really wrapping to a close. The only thing I would add to that is, I guess my bias is that it's designers and architects' responsibility to envision that change, and to perhaps step out of those boundaries or understand the limits and gently nudge them in different directions, to imagine how new private-public partnerships could emerge in ways where there is a requirement for roof public pools that are in new buildings that actually retake part of the privatized land and kind of give it back to the public good. Now, whether that would be owned and operated by parks, we don't yet know. But I think that this question of new forms of public, new sponsorings of public space, I think are at the core of really what we're seeing in the work of Plus Pool and in the work of others, where we're starting to imagine the spectacular as an idea to invigorate the imagination. So I want to thank everybody today for coming and giving away their precious Saturday. It's been a really great time to kind of hear all of these thoughts. And I want to thank all of the students and faculty who joined and asked questions. It's been, I think it's a great moment to kind of reconnoiter around these topics, particularly for our students who are in the trenches of designing new futures right now. So thank you all very much, and we'll hang out for a couple minutes, but I think we're going to conclude here. Thank you, guys.